Would you still save a drowning baby if you knew she would grow up to murder 10,000 people? Not in war, not by accident, not through indirect consequence, but by her own will, conscious, deliberate, violent. Imagine her tiny hand clutching your finger as you pull her from the river. Imagine the relief, the gratitude of the parents, the headlines praising your heroism. You're celebrated. You're proud, you sleep peacefully. And then 25 years later, you see her face on the news, not as a victim, but as the one who caused it. A city in smoke, thousands dead, no warning, no remorse, just a face you once saw underwater, choking, terrified, and saved. Does that moment become a mistake? You try to trace the chain backward, to find where the blame belongs. With her? With you? With the world that shaped her. But part of you keeps returning to the river, to your outstretched hand, to the seconds when you held her life in yours and chose to give it back. You didn't know, you tell yourself. You couldn't have known, and yet you wonder if someone had told you clearly, truthfully, with absolute certainty, what she would become. Would you still have saved her? Not hypothetically, not abstractly, but actually, your feet in the mud, her body limp in your arms, your heartbeat racing, her lips blue. Would you hesitate? Would you let her slip? You imagine doing nothing, standing still, letting the river decide, pretending the future had nothing to do with you. But now you've seen it. You know what she becomes, and that changes everything. You're not saving a child anymore. You're preserving a future atrocity. Does that make it murder if you let her die, or justice, or self-defense, or something worse? Because you didn't kill her, you just didn't save her. And now you start to understand how thin that line really is. You've always believed in protecting the innocent. But what if innocence is just a temporary state, a disguise, a momentary pause before harm unfolds? Can someone still be innocent if their future is monstrous? And can you still be moral if you let them die because of it? You think about what it means to act now for something that hasn't happened yet. To punish a person for crimes they haven't committed. To trade certainty for prevention. But it isn't hypothetical. Not anymore. You're not guessing. You know, you saw the explosion. You heard the screams, you watched the footage. It happened, and it was her, the baby you saved, the life you gave back. You want to believe that goodness is always right, that saving a life can never be wrong. But that belief feels thinner now, fragile, too simple for what you know. You start to wonder how many other lives have followed this pattern. How many people were saved, protected, loved before they became something unrecognizable, before they caused pain that rippled outward endlessly. And how many were lost, ignored, discarded, left to die, not because of who they were, but because of what someone believed they might become. You feel the weight of both sides. The guilt of saving, the guilt of letting go, the inability to choose without consequence. And now you start to realize morality doesn't protect you from the future. It only comforts you in the moment. It tells you to save the baby, always, even if the baby grows up to destroy everything. Even if the face you save becomes the face that haunts you. Because the horror isn't just what she did, it's that you gave her the chance to do it. Why is it easier to believe a lie you've told yourself than a truth someone else painfully reveals? You trust your own thoughts. That's what makes them dangerous. You assume that because they come from within, they must be aligned with who you really are. But the brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't reward truth. It rewards survival, coherence, and emotional comfort. And to achieve those, it lies to you. Not just once, not just in moments of stress or fear, constantly, quietly. Without your consent or awareness, it smooths over contradictions. It edits memories. It fabricates reasons after decisions are already made. It creates a version of reality that feels consistent, even when it isn't true. You remember yourself more kindly than you were. You exaggerate the pain others caused and downplay the harm you inflicted. You believe you're rational when you're mostly reactive. You think you understand your motives when you're mostly guessing. Your brain feeds you stories that make you feel intact, justified, and good. And those stories are more persuasive than any argument, because they come dressed as internal certainty. You don't question the voice inside your head when it tells you that you tried your best, that others were unfair, that your anger was righteous. You believe it because it sounds like you, but it isn't you. It's the voice of your defense mechanisms, wearing your tone, using your memories, shaping your beliefs. The mind has evolved not to seek truth, but to maintain a stable narrative, a self-image that can survive contradiction. So when a fact threatens that image, when you learn something that makes you feel weak, guilty, confused, your brain resists. It distorts. It denies. It tells you the problem is somewhere else, someone else, anywhere but within, and you listen. Not because you're weak, but because the alternative is unbearable. To fully face yourself would mean acknowledging that you've been wrong about who you are, that your memories are unreliable, that your certainty is constructed, that your values are sometimes masks, that your good intentions don't erase your harm. There are lies you've repeated so often that they've become indistinguishable from identity. Lies about your childhood. Lies about your resilience. Lies about how much control you really have. You tell yourself you're over it, that you've moved on, that it doesn't affect you anymore. And maybe you believe that. But belief doesn't make it true. It just makes it easier to function. You tell yourself you forgive people. You still secretly resent. You claim to have learned from past mistakes, while quietly preparing to repeat them. You say you're trying your best when you know, in moments of silence, that you're avoiding what matters most, and your brain helps you believe all of it. Because it's safer that way. Because the truth would require change, risk, discomfort. And your mind is built to minimize those. Even your fears lie to you. They exaggerate danger, predict humiliation, conjure threats that don't exist. You've avoided entire paths in life, not because they were impossible, but because your brain whispered that you'd fail, that you'd be exposed, that you wouldn't survive the shame. And maybe you never questioned that voice. Maybe you built a life around those quiet lies, mistaking them for wisdom. You don't notice the lies because they aren't spoken. They're built into perception itself, into what you focus on, what you ignore, what you interpret as meaningful. The brain filters information not by truth but by what confirms what you already believe. You see what you expect. You remember what fits the story. You connect dots that were never meant to be connected. And when someone challenges you, gently, logically, even lovingly, your mind defends itself like it's under attack. You feel misunderstood, misjudged, mistreated. You replay the conversation not to learn, but to win. You search for flaws in their words instead of reflecting on the possibility that they might be right. Because if they are right, then you've been wrong. And your brain doesn't tolerate that easily, so it distracts you. It gives you new thoughts, more comfortable explanations. You reinterpret what happened. You tell yourself they were projecting, or too sensitive, or simply didn't understand the full context. You rebuild the lie, and it feels like healing. But it's not. It's insulation. Over time, the lies become scaffolding. Your relationships are shaped by what you pretend not to feel. Your choices are limited by what you pretend not to want. Your identity is narrowed by what you pretend isn't true. And slowly, the real you, whatever that is, drifts further from reach. Because there's a cost to lying, even when the lies are internal. The cost is disconnection from others, from reality, from yourself. You begin to wonder why things feel hollow, why intimacy feels distant, why satisfaction never lasts. You search for external causes, but the fracture is inside, and it deepens every time you ignore the discomfort. Every time you choose coherence over honesty. Every time you call fear intuition and denial peace. The brain wants equilibrium, but not growth, not truth, not clarity. So if you want those things, you have to fight your own mind. You have to notice the ease with which you justify, rationalize, explain. You have to pause when a thought feels too convenient, too flattering, too aligned with what you already want to believe. And then slowly, quietly, you have to ask, what if I'm wrong? What if I've been wrong for a long time? What if the person I trust the least has been right about me all along? What if every time you said, I love you, what you really meant was, my brain is hooked on you like a drug, not as a metaphor, not as a comparison, but literally? What if the feeling you call love is nothing more than a chemical dependency, your body formed in response to another person's presence? Think about the last time you felt infatuated with someone. The rush, the obsessive thoughts, the sense of purpose that seemed to flood in all at once. The way your mood changed when they responded, when they smiled, when they touched you. That wasn't magic. That wasn't fate. That was your brain releasing dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, neurotransmitters designed to bind you to them like glue. You didn't fall in love. You were chemically hijacked. And once that process starts, it's almost impossible to reverse. You crave them. You miss them. You think about them constantly, even when you don't want to. When they pull away, it feels like withdrawal. When they return, the high comes back. You call it romance. But if a substance made you feel this way, made you euphoric, made you dependent, made you sick when it was taken away, you'd call it an addiction. So why is love different? Maybe it's not. Maybe the people you think you care about most, the ones you claim you couldn't live without, aren't special in the way you think they are. Maybe they're just the ones who triggered the strongest neurological response in you. Maybe they became important because your brain decided they were, not because they actually are. And if that's true, then everything changes. It means you don't love your partner because of who they are. You love them because your brain associated them with pleasure and safety, and now it's hooked. It means your family bonds might have more to do with evolutionary conditioning than any genuine emotional depth. It means when someone says, I'll love you forever, what they really mean is, my current neurochemistry is calibrated to respond to you positively, and I hope that continues. It sounds cold, but it also explains a lot. It explains why people can fall out of love without warning, why passion dies suddenly, why people cheat, why people mourn breakups like death. Because beneath all the poetry and sentiment, love is a system of chemical rewards. If those chemicals stop firing, the feeling fades. If someone else fires them more intensely, your loyalty shifts. You think you're making moral choices. You're not. You're chasing a fix. And that raises another question. If love is just addiction, does it mean that loss is just detox? Maybe the pain of heartbreak isn't about the person at all. Maybe it's your body screaming for a chemical it no longer receives. You miss them, but maybe that's just your nervous system crashing, recalibrating. You want them back, but maybe that's just your brain begging for the high to return. You're not grieving a person. You're grieving a chemical pattern. And if that's true, then even the noblest sacrifices made in love, people giving up careers, friends, futures, might not be noble at all. They might be desperate. The frantic behavior of someone trying to protect their supply, willing to do anything to keep the source close, even lie, even betray, even destroy themselves. So what happens when you realize this? What happens when you begin to see the people you love, not as sacred, irreplaceable individuals, but as sources of neural stimulation? What happens when you start to recognize your affection as biochemical attachment, your commitment as chemical dependency? You might try to deny it, insist that your feelings are deeper, purer. But that's part of the addiction too. The need to protect the illusion, the need to believe that love means more than chemistry. Because if it doesn't, if love is just the brain tricking itself into needing someone, then what does that say about you? What does it say about your memories, your promises, your grief? What does it say about the way you love your children, or your parents, or the person lying beside you right now? It says something you might not want to admit, that if your brain had been wired differently, if you'd met someone else first, if a few moments in your life had unfolded in another order, you might be addicted to someone else entirely. You might feel just as strongly about a stranger, given the right chemicals at the right time. You might not love who you think you love. You might not even know what love is. Because maybe there's no mystery to it. Maybe there's no soul, no destiny, no deeper meaning. Maybe it's just a feedback loop your brain created, and now it won't let go. And maybe the only reason you're still clinging to the idea of love as something transcendent is because you're too afraid to face what you'd lose if you let it go. Not the person, but the high. Some people are born without guilt, and they thrive, not in secret, not in shadows, but often in plain sight. In offices, in boardrooms, in families, smiling, calm, unaffected. They make decisions that most would agonize over, and they sleep easily afterward. No remorse, no second guessing, just clarity, efficiency. You've met them, though you may not have noticed, because guilt is something we assume is universal, something that comes naturally, but for some, it doesn't. It never has, and it never will. They learn early that guilt is a weakness, or maybe they never feel it to begin with. They watch others squirm, hesitate, stumble over conscience. They don't. When they hurt someone, they don't replay it in their heads. They don't lie awake at night, wondering if they went too far. They just move forward. They call it realism, sometimes even leadership. But what happens when a person with no guilt is also intelligent, charming, ambitious? They rise, because guilt slows people down, makes them apologize, retract, delay. A person without guilt can fire someone without flinching, exploit someone without hesitation, manipulate without pause, and they often get praised for it. For being decisive, unshakable, focused. We tell ourselves that empathy and kindness win in the long run. But look closer. The systems we've built, corporate, political, social, often reward the absence of guilt. They reward those who can act ruthlessly and smile afterward. Those who can pretend to care just enough to be palatable. Those who can use morality as a tool, not a limit. You might think this would be obvious, that we'd spot them, call them out, push them aside, but we rarely do. Because guiltless people are often good at mimicking remorse. They know the words. They know when to lower their eyes, when to nod solemnly, when to say, "I take full responsibility," even when they feel nothing. And because they don't feel guilt, they aren't weighed down by shame or self-doubt. They're free to focus completely on results, image, power, and still, part of you resists this. Part of you believes there must be a cost, that somewhere, somehow, they must pay for what they lack, that a life without guilt must also be a life without depth, without connection, without meaning. But that's not always true. Many of them are loved, admired, promoted. They build relationships, families, reputations. They know how to perform the rituals of emotion. They learn what makes people trust them, and they use it, not always maliciously, sometimes just strategically, but always without the internal friction that holds others back. And here's where it gets more uncomfortable. What if their lack of guilt makes them better at certain things? What if surgeons, soldiers, CEOs, what if they perform better when unburdened by conscience? What if the very traits that disturb you are the same traits that allow them to make brutal, necessary decisions others can't? Would you want a surgeon who pauses out of guilt, or one who acts without hesitation? A commander who breaks down after each loss, or one who keeps going? A leader who agonizes over every moral consequence, or one who gets results? Maybe you've already benefited from someone else's lack of guilt without knowing it. Maybe your safety, your success, your comfort has been secured by people who felt nothing when they made the hard call. And if that's true, do you want them to feel guilt now? Or do you just want them to pretend? Now imagine something else. Imagine being born without guilt, but into a world where everyone expects you to feel it. Imagine learning, very young, that you're different, that you don't cry when others do, that you're not sorry when you're told you should be, that your mind stays quiet while everyone else's is screaming. You wouldn't feel broken, you'd feel clear, but you'd learn to fake it. To smile, nod, apologize, while inside, nothing moves. You wouldn't be evil, you'd just be unburdened. And the world would mistake your calm for coldness, your confidence for arrogance. But still, you'd thrive. Because the world rewards those who don't flinch. And maybe the truly disturbing part is this: guilt isn't a universal trait. It's a neurological pattern, a product of brain chemistry, upbringing, environment. Some people have more of it, some less, and some almost none at all. So what if morality isn't a matter of choice, but of wiring? What if the thing that holds you back isn't virtue, but a quirk of biology? And what if the person who feels nothing when they hurt others isn't broken, they're just built differently, and their design lets them win? You start to see it now. The most guiltless people aren't monsters in shadows. They're often leaders, innovators, even heroes. Not because they're good, but because they can act when others hesitate, because they move forward when others freeze. And that leaves you with a quiet, unsettling question. If guilt is a burden, and they live without it, are they free? Or are you just trapped by something they never had to carry? Would you torture one child to cure cancer forever? Not in theory, not as a thought experiment. Right now, the child is real, awake, trembling. The room is small, sterile, soundproof. There's no audience, no judgment, no oversight. Just you, the instruments, and the child. You are told the truth. If you go through with this, cancer will end. All of it. Every form, every case. No one will ever suffer through it again. Not your parents, not your friends, not you. It will vanish from the world like it was never there. But the price is pain. Prolonged, intentional, inflicted pain. This child won't die, but they will suffer deeply, unimaginably, for hours, maybe days, screaming, pleading, breaking, and only you can do it. No delegation, no diffusion of guilt, It must be your hands. Your choices, your responsibility. At first, you recoil. It feels monstrous. You search for alternatives. There must be another way, but there isn't. You are told clearly, calmly, this is the cost. One child's agony, once for an end to the suffering of millions. So you hesitate. Not because you're unsure it would work, but because the reality is too immediate. You imagine the child's face, their voice. You picture the fear in their eyes, and something inside you twists. You want to look away, but you can't. Then a second thought comes. What about your loved ones? The ones who are sick now? What about the children already dying in hospitals? The mothers, the fathers, the teenagers with shaved heads and hollow eyes. What about them? You start to rationalize. Maybe it's just pain. Pain passes. They'll live. They'll heal. Maybe, in time, this child will even understand. Maybe they'll be proud, knowing they saved the world. You tell yourself this to soften the image. But it doesn't soften, because pain doesn't happen in the abstract. It happens moment by moment, breath by breath. And in those moments, all your justifications vanish. The child doesn't care about the future. They don't feel noble, they just hurt. Still, you consider going through with it. Not because you want to, but because the alternative feels worse. Cancer continues. People you love die slowly, horribly. You'll always know you had a chance to stop it. And you said no. So which guilt would be worse? The guilt of causing pain, or the guilt of allowing endless pain to continue, unchecked? You begin to realize this isn't a question about morality. It's about proximity. The closer you are to the child, the harder it becomes to act. If someone else did it, and you never had to see, it might feel acceptable. But this demands your full presence, and you're not sure you can bear it. But then again, are you already bearing something similar? You support systems that inflict suffering, so long as you don't see it. You eat food made through cruelty. You use products built on exploitation. You fund wars with your silence. All because the harm is hidden, abstract, distant. So maybe this scenario isn't so different. Maybe the only change is honesty. Maybe this is just a mirror, forcing you to look directly at the pain you usually ignore. You tell yourself you care about children, about ethics, about doing good. But here, stripped of distance and illusion, the truth surfaces. Your compassion has limits. Your morality bends under pressure, and you hate seeing that clearly. You want to believe there's a line you wouldn't cross. But this child is right there, and so are the millions who would be saved. You don't get to be clean. You only get to choose the shape of your guilt. And what if the child knew? What if you explained everything to them, honestly, gently? What if they said yes? Would it make a difference, or would their consent just deepen the horror? You start to wonder if the worst part isn't the choice, but what it reveals about you. That you might say yes, that you might do it, that you could walk into that room, close the door, and live with what follows. Because the moment you admit that, something inside you shifts. The idea of being good starts to dissolve. You are no longer separate from the people you once judged. You are capable of atrocity, given the right justification. And maybe the world already runs on decisions like this. Quiet horrors committed for a greater good. Sacrifices made in silence, their victims forgotten. Maybe this isn't a hypothetical at all. Maybe it's just a clearer version of reality. And now, even if you walk away, even if you never touch the child, the question stays. Not about what you would do, but what you could do, what you might do, and what that means about who you really are. What if none of it ever happened? Not just the events you remember, but the person you think you are because of them. What if your childhood memories were inserted yesterday? What if your friendships, your traumas, your moments of joy and regret were fabrications? You'd still feel them. They'd still shape how you think, how you react, what you fear, and what you want. But if they're not real, if they never actually occurred, then what exactly are you? You don't notice the difference. That's the most disturbing part. The brain doesn't store truth. It stores coherence, patterns, stories that make sense of the present. Your sense of self isn't built on facts, it's built on the illusion of continuity. And if the foundation is false, but the structure still stands, what does that make you? You believe in your past because you remember it, but memory isn't evidence. It's belief dressed as certainty. You feel sure you graduated, that you fell in love, that someone hurt you deeply. But all of that certainty comes from inside you. Nothing external, nothing you can verify without already believing it. Suppose a machine replaced your memories last night, gave you a lifetime of fake experiences, but left your personality intact. You'd wake up thinking you were the same person. You'd feel sadness for losses that never happened, pride in accomplishments you never achieved. You'd cry over people who never existed, but your body would still react. Your mind would still grieve. You'd be haunted by ghosts that were never real. Would that still count as you? Or did the person you were yesterday quietly vanish, replaced by a convincingly similar imposter? And here's the part that's harder to ignore. This is already happening. Not with machines, not with science fiction. Just time, just decay. Your memories aren't fixed. They change, they fade. You rewrite them constantly, unknowingly. And what you believe today about your past self isn't a preserved truth, it's a reconstruction. An edited, compressed story with most of the details missing. You cling to identity as though it's stable, but it's not. It's the name you give to a process. A fragile pattern that only holds together because it keeps repeating itself. Once the repetition breaks, once the memories drift too far from what actually happened, the pattern changes. And if the pattern changes enough, at what point are you no longer the same? You could lose every memory tomorrow. Forget your name, your family, your history. And someone new would take your place, still in your body, still with your face. But would that person be you, or a stranger who just happens to look like you? You assume continuity means existence. That because you feel the same today as you did yesterday, your self has persisted. But that feeling could be simulated. You don't need a real past to feel like you have one. You just need a story that makes sense. A story you're willing to believe. So what's the difference between you and someone who just believes they're you? What separates a real identity from a convincing replica? Maybe there is no difference. Maybe you are already a story pretending to be a person. A script written by fading neurons and fragile synapses, recited each morning as though it means something. But if the script changes, or if someone else starts reciting it, what's left of the original? You tell yourself that you are more than memory, that you are your choices, your values, your intentions. But where did those come from? Weren't they shaped by the very memories you now suspect might be false? If your values are rooted in lies, if your intentions come from fictional pain, can they still be real? If you love someone because you remember the bond you built, but that bond never happened, what is your love made of? Is it still love, or just a reaction to a lie? If you feel guilt for something you believe you did, but it was implanted, fabricated, never actually occurred, are you still responsible? And if you wake up one day with someone else's memories, living someone else's story, would that story become yours? Or would you quietly die the moment your real past was erased, leaving behind a replica too convinced to notice the difference? You think the answer would be obvious. that you'd know if you were fake. But what if the feeling of being real is just part of the illusion? Maybe the truth isn't that your memories are real or fake. Maybe it's that you never existed at all, only the story did. A self assembled from false parts, doing its best to act like a person. And if the story changes, then so do you. Without memory, there is no self. And if the memories were never real to begin with, then what exactly have you been this whole time? Why is it that you're more likely to kill someone in a crowd than help a single person alone? You probably don't believe that. Not consciously, but think back, honestly. Have you ever ignored someone in pain because no one else around you reacted? Walked past someone struggling, thinking someone else will help? That's how it begins. A strange, quiet phenomenon. You feel something's wrong. You see someone in need, but instead of acting, you wait. You look around, you check the crowd, and when no one moves, neither do you. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like nothing at all, like silence. But that silence is a choice. You think you're moral, empathetic, the kind of person who would stand up, speak out, do what's right. But in the presence of a group, your instincts change. Your responsibility dissolves. The more people there are, the less responsible you feel. That's the effect. It even has a name: diffusion of responsibility. If one person walks by a collapsed stranger, it feels cruel, inhumane. But if 10 people walk by, it becomes invisible, normal. You stop seeing it as a personal failure and start seeing it as something inevitable. And soon you forget you even noticed it at all. Now flip the situation, not ignoring someone, but hurting them. A violent mob, a digital pile-on, a political rally spiraling into chaos. In those moments, you feel something else. Not guilt, not hesitation, but permission. And that's the part no one wants to admit. You'd never push someone, never scream threats, never throw a brick on your own. But surrounded by a crowd, a mask falls over your face. You feel anonymous, blameless. The violence doesn't feel like yours. It feels shared, dispersed. It feels safe. And so something terrifying happens. You don't just become willing to hurt someone in a crowd. You become eager to. You feel relief, excitement, a release of something you didn't know you were holding back. Not because you're a monster, but because the crowd tells you this isn't on you. You're not responsible. Now think about that carefully. You're more likely to help someone if you're the only one around. More likely to kill if you're surrounded by others. Why? What changes? It's not your morals, not your beliefs. It's the presence of witnesses. Paradoxically, witnesses make you disappear. They dissolve your sense of self, and without that, morality becomes optional. That's what makes this so unsettling. Your morality isn't a solid foundation. It's a performance. A performance you maintain when you know you'll be held accountable. But when you feel invisible, when you feel like part of something larger, your lines blur. You do things you'd swear you never could. You watch things happen and feel no urgency to stop them. You become passive when action is needed. Aggressive when restraint is called for, because you're no longer acting for yourself. You're acting for the crowd or against it. But either way, it isn't about you anymore. That loss of self is what opens the door. Most atrocities in history didn't start with hatred. They started with silence, with complicity, with people who looked around, saw no one else moving, and decided they wouldn't either. It's not always cruelty that drives evil. Sometimes it's nothing at all, just stillness, just waiting. And in that silence, others step forward. They push further. They scream louder. And once they begin, the barrier breaks. Now the violence has momentum. And you feel it too. The temptation to join in, to become part of the force, to dissolve into the crowd and let the crowd carry the blame. You wouldn't do it alone. You know that. But you also know something else now. You might do it in a group. You might walk past someone dying on the sidewalk because no one else has stopped. You might join a crowd chanting hate, not because you believe in it, but because it feels good to belong. You might stand by as something terrible happens and convince yourself there was nothing you could have done, but you could have. You always could have. That's the weight, the unbearable, quiet weight, that in every moment of complicity, the only thing missing was one person stepping forward. Not a hero, not a savior, just someone who didn't look to the crowd for permission. But that person is rare, because being alone, truly alone in your action, is terrifying. It means standing still while everyone moves. It means feeling the eyes of others and not hiding behind them. It means owning what you do and what you don't do, with no one to share the blame. And most of us are not ready for that. We want to believe we're good people, that we'd help, that we'd intervene, but we don't want to be the only one. We don't want to act while everyone else watches. So we wait. And in that waiting, someone dies. The truth is hard to face, but it's simple. You'd kill in a crowd before you'd help one person alone. And deep down, you already know that. Who are you when no one sees you? Not who you believe you are, not who you want to be, but who you become in moments no one else will ever witness. The quiet, unmeasured version. The one without consequence, without performance, without reward. You think your personality is consistent. You think the core of who you are remains steady, no matter the setting. But that's not quite true. The way you speak shifts depending on who you're speaking to. Your tone softens, hardens, hesitates, depending on how much power you sense in the room. Your posture changes. Your thoughts change. Sometimes even your values seem to bend. But none of that feels like lying. It feels automatic, invisible. It feels like adaptation, survival, being human. Still, that leaves a question lingering quietly beneath it all. If so much of who you are responds to what others see, what remains when no one is watching? When there's no audience, no mirror, no judgment? What happens to you when you're alone long enough to stop performing? Maybe you think you become more authentic. Maybe you believe your private self is more real. But what if it's not? What if solitude doesn't make you more genuine, only more fragmented, more unstable, more unrecognizable? You might imagine the you that no one sees is purer. But purity isn't what surfaces in isolation. It's impulses, instincts, hidden hungers, old resentments. You do things you'd never do in front of someone else, sometimes small, like talking to yourself in a voice you'd never use. Sometimes worse, resenting people you claim to love, indulging in fantasies that contradict your values, thinking thoughts that if spoken aloud would make others fear you, and you tell yourself it's harmless, that everyone does it. But repetition has power. What you do repeatedly becomes easier to do again. A version of you begins to form in those silent hours, one with its own logic, its own tolerance, its own emotional shape. You just don't think of it as separate because you don't want to see how different it really is. It doesn't feel like lying when you smile in public, when you say the right thing, when you hold back the darker impulse. But those aren't masks, they're tools, protective, functional. You wear them so well, you forget you're wearing them, until the moment you're alone and they fall away. And you feel it, something shift in you, something unspoken. Take the front seat. Not evil, just unfiltered. Not cruel, just unsoftened. The person you are when you're alone might not be a monster, but they might not be someone you'd recognize in the mirror either. They might be colder, angrier, pettier, or simply blank, lacking the sharpness that comes from being seen. The idea that our true self emerges in solitude is comforting. But what if it's wrong? What if your real personality only exists through other people? What if there is no you without the way you're seen? No stable identity, just shifting versions, constructed and dissolved in the presence or absence of others. And if that's true, then what are you when no one's watching? Are you free or are you lost? Do you feel more yourself or do you quietly disappear? Maybe you've already felt it. The longer you go without interaction, the more you drift. Your thoughts become stranger. Less verbal, time loses shape. You start doing things you can't explain, things that don't make sense later. As if a different self is living in your body, just for a while. One who doesn't care about kindness or truth or decency. One who doesn't care about anything at all. That version fades the moment you see another person. You shift back instantly. Words return. Posture corrects. The self you know reappears. It feels like waking up. But what if the version that disappeared wasn't a dream? What if it's always there, watching from the dark, waiting for the silence to return? And now you're not sure which self is real, the one others know, or the one only you meet in the quiet. Or maybe realness isn't the point. Maybe personality itself isn't a thing you have, but a thing you perform. And without an audience, the performance ends. The structure collapses. So you keep yourself seen. You fill your life with voices, with screens, with distractions, because you know what happens in the silence. You know who begins to speak, and you're not sure you like what they have to say. Because maybe the most disturbing version of you isn't the one hiding from others. It's the one hiding from you. Why does it bother you when someone refuses your help? You tell yourself it's compassion, that you're just trying to make their life easier. You say you're offering support, advice, a solution. But when they turn you down, when they resist, or ignore you, or do the opposite, something inside you shifts. You feel frustrated, dismissed, sometimes even angry, and you don't ask why, you just push harder. You say it's because you care, but care shouldn't need obedience. Care shouldn't turn cold the moment it's rejected. So what is it, really? Sometimes helping isn't just about kindness. It's about control, subtle, dressed in good intentions, but control all the same. You want to fix their life, not just because they're suffering, but because their suffering makes you uncomfortable. Because watching someone fall apart without intervening makes you feel powerless. And you hate that feeling more than you care to admit. Helping becomes a way to silence your own helplessness, to restore a sense of order. If they just listen to you, follow your advice, take your hand, then maybe the world will make sense again. Maybe you'll feel needed, capable, right. And when they don't, when they resist, it threatens something deeper. It forces you to face the truth. They have the right to make choices, even bad ones. They have the right to reject your version of what's best, and that stings. Because deep down, you weren't offering freedom. You were offering correction, framed as care. But what if they're not broken? What if they don't need fixing? What if your urge to help is more about you than them? You don't notice the ways you invade, the way your concern becomes pressure, the way your guidance becomes a test, the way your help becomes a condition for love, respect, patience. You say you're just trying to support them, but it's support with strings. Support that depends on cooperation. Support that quietly punishes non-compliance. You don't call it manipulation. You'd never admit that. But if your kindness disappears the moment someone says no, then it was never kindness at all. Sometimes people need to fail. Sometimes they need to resist. Sometimes they just need space. And when you can't allow that, when you must step in, must correct, must improve, It's not about them anymore. It's about your discomfort. With watching people suffer on their own terms, you tell yourself you know better, that your experience, your insight, your love gives you the right to intervene. But what if you're wrong? What if your vision of better is just your own bias, your own fear? What if you're helping them toward a version of life they never asked for? And if they change just to please you, if they surrender just to make the pressure stop, have you really helped them? Or have you just overwritten them? You want to believe you're saving them, but sometimes helping is just control by another name. Sometimes it's the need to be needed. Sometimes it's the refusal to let others live lives you wouldn't choose. And the hardest part to admit, the part you avoid at all costs, is that you might not be helping them at all. You might just be protecting yourself from guilt, from chaos, from irrelevance. Because if you're not fixing, guiding, correcting, then what are you? Who are you? If the people around you don't need saving, that's the fear that hides behind your help, the silent, uncomfortable truth that maybe you need them to be broken, just enough for you to matter, just enough for your role to make sense. And once you see that, once you recognize how easily care becomes control, you can't unsee it. You start to wonder how much of what you've called help was really about love, and how much was just a quieter form of domination, but insistent, constant, dressed in kindness, coated in concern, but still control. And once you feel that weight, once you see how deeply it runs, you start to understand something even more disturbing, that maybe the most controlling people aren't the ones who shout or demand or punish. Maybe the most controlling people are the ones who whisper, "I'm just trying to help," and can't stand it when you say no. Most people don't want the truth. They want relief. You can see it in the way someone changes the subject when the conversation gets too close to something real, in how quickly people laugh, explain, or distract themselves when a hard truth starts to surface. It's not that they don't understand, it's that they don't want. Because truth is cold. It doesn't care how you feel. It doesn't wait until you're ready. It doesn't soften its edges to spare your pride. And most people, when they really think about it, aren't built for that. They say they want honesty. They say they value clarity. But what they usually mean is, tell me the version that doesn't make me feel small. Tell me the truth, but let me still feel in control. Let me believe I'm good. Let me believe I'm safe. Let me believe I'm right. And when the truth doesn't allow for those things, it becomes unbearable. Think about the lies people choose to live with, the stories they tell about why things happened the way they did, why they failed, why they hurt someone, why their life didn't turn out the way they expected. The moment you offer a truth that threatens those stories even gently, they push it away. Not because it's wrong, but because it takes away their protection. Relief is protection. It shields you from the slow, corrosive drip of shame, doubt, and fear. Truth removes that shield. And that's why, when people are in pain, they don't go looking for what's real. They look for what will make the pain stop. A comforting belief, a convenient villain, a distraction, a justification. You might think you're different. You might think, "No, I'd want to know." But would you? Would you really want to hear that the problem wasn't them? It was you. That the reason you keep ending up in the same situation isn't bad luck. It's a pattern you refuse to break. That the life you imagined for yourself is never going to happen, and that it's no one's fault but your own. Would you want that truth? Or would you, like most people, reach for relief instead? You might argue that truth is always better, that it's the foundation for real growth. And maybe that's true, but it doesn't make it easier to swallow. Growth hurts. Change hurts. And most people will avoid that hurt as long as they possibly can. They'll stay in relationships that are slowly destroying them because the truth that it's over is too painful. They'll keep working jobs they hate because the truth that they're afraid to fail is too confronting. They'll keep pretending to be someone they're not because the truth that they don't know who they are is too destabilizing. And if you try to tell them, they'll smile, nod, and thank you for your insight. Then they'll go right back to what they were doing. It's not just about comfort. It's about survival. People need a narrative that allows them to function. The truth, unfiltered, often destroys that. That's why denial exists. That's why rationalizations feel so soothing. That's why people cling to half-truths and convenient illusions, even when they know, somewhere deep down, that it's not quite right. Because even a broken story is better than none at all. This is what makes truth dangerous. Not because it's false, but because it leaves nothing to hide behind. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you say it out loud, you can't take it back. And once it lands in someone else's mind, you can't control what it does to them. That's why people react so violently to truth. Why they call it offensive, cruel, or unnecessary. Not because it's any of those things, but because it threatens the thing they're really trying to protect, their sense of self. Relief tells them they're okay, truth tells them they're not. And between those two options, which do you think most people will choose? Even when the truth could help them grow. Even when it could free them. Even when it could change everything for the better. They'll still reach for the story that soothes. They'll choose the lie that fits over the truth that breaks. And here's the part you don't want to hear. So will you. Not always, not consciously. But when the stakes are high, when the truth threatens too much, you'll find a way to soften it, to look past it, to make it easier to live with. That's not weakness. It's human, but it means something you should never forget. Wanting the truth is not the same as being ready for it. And most people, most of the time, aren't. Because relief feels like peace. Truth feels like pain. And if you had to choose between the two, in your quietest, most fragile moment, you already know what you'd reach for. What you see in the mirror isn't you. It's just a delay. A three-dimensional echo of your face, your body, reflected photons, bouncing back milliseconds after they left you. But it's not the time delay that matters. It's the illusion it creates. You look at that reflection and think you're seeing yourself. You're not. You're seeing an image shaped by angles, lighting, imperfections in the glass. You're seeing your face from a perspective you've never truly experienced. No matter how often you look, you'll never see yourself the way others do. You'll never hear your voice the way it really sounds. Your entire perception of your body is filtered, distorted, misrepresented by biology, by memory, by tools designed only to imitate reality. But that doesn't stop you from trusting it. You use that reflection to judge your worth, to assess your attractiveness, to guess at how others perceive you. You form beliefs, opinions, even emotions based on something you can't directly experience. You build an identity on a copy of a copy, and you call it self. Yet what if even that was a comfort? What if the real disconnection runs deeper than the glass? When you think of yourself, your personality, your habits, your desires, you imagine something stable. You think there's a consistent you, beneath all the thoughts and reactions. But if you look closely, moment to moment, you won't find anything permanent. No central observer, no fixed point. Just thoughts appearing, feelings shifting, memories rewriting themselves slightly, each time you recall them. Your brain is always catching up. It processes sound after it's heard. light after it's seen, pain after it's registered. You're not experiencing the world in real time. You're watching a replay a few milliseconds late. Enough time for your brain to edit, clean up, fill in gaps. Enough time to create coherence where there is none. Enough time to lie to you convincingly. And yet, you feel present. You feel like you're here. You feel like you're in control. But that feeling too is a product. Manufactured, maintained. A comforting illusion of immediacy. You never question the reflection, because questioning it threatens your sense of reality. It's easier to believe the mirror shows you who you are. But it doesn't. It never has. It's just a surface reacting to light. And inside your mind, the same thing is happening. You respond to stimulus, to patterns, to internal echoes, and then you label it me. You pretend it's stable, but your reflection in the mirror, just like your sense of self, is always a few steps behind. Always reconstructing what already happened. You're never truly in the moment. You're always seeing the aftermath. And this delay matters, because it means the person you think you are is already gone by the time you notice them. You're chasing a moving target, trying to catch a reflection that shifts just as you reach for it. This is why you feel lost sometimes, disconnected, like a stranger in your own body, because you're reacting to a delayed broadcast of your life, while the real version slips by, unseen. And the more you try to define yourself through memories, habits, relationships, the more you solidify a version of you that no longer exists. You fall in love with your reflection, not realizing that the real you was already gone when that image appeared. You see this most clearly when you try to change. You tell yourself, I will be different. But even that voice, the one making the promise, is already outdated. It's built from thoughts you had yesterday, fears you haven't yet outgrown, ideas about yourself that no longer apply. You make decisions based on who you were, not who you are. Because the you making the decision doesn't exist in real time. It exists in lag. And this isn't a flaw, it's how consciousness works. It's how your sense of reality is assembled. But it means you're always slightly behind your own life. Always a few frames late. Always watching, never being. So what does it mean to be authentic when everything you experience has already passed? What does it mean to know yourself if the self you're knowing is already gone? You might think the answer is to become more present, more aware. But even awareness is delayed. Even your best efforts to anchor yourself in the now are based on sensations and thoughts that have already occurred. There is no now that you can touch. Only the memory of it. This is the uncomfortable truth. Your reflection is just a delay, and so is your mind. So is your sense of self. There's nothing solid to hold on to. No single moment where you can say, this is who I am. There never was. Would you ever kill someone if the right word made it feel justified? Not a command, not a threat. Just a single word, spoken softly, without violence. No argument, no debate. Just a shift. Something subtle. Maybe it's terrorist. Maybe it's traitor. Maybe it's justice. You hear it, and your certainty begins to slide. At first, you're sure of your morality. You know what's right. You'd never harm someone without cause. You'd never cross the line, but the word creeps in slowly. It redefines. It recategorizes. It moves the person from one moral category to another. And you don't even notice when it happens. The person you once saw as human now becomes something else. Something dangerous. Something different. You tell yourself they chose it. They deserve it. And suddenly violence doesn't feel like violence anymore. It feels like defense, like order, like necessary action. Think about how often this happens. In politics, in war, in history. A population labeled infestation. A movement called extremism. A belief dismissed as madness. The moment the label attaches, the rules change. You feel justified. You stop questioning. The shift is complete. It's not logic that drives this. It's association. The word becomes a shortcut. You don't think about the individual anymore. You think about what the word represents. The word absorbs the person. And when that happens, morality no longer applies to them in the way it used to. But here's the quiet horror. You still believe you're acting morally. You feel calm, certain, responsible, even compassionate. Because the language has shifted your emotional alignment without you realizing it. You haven't lost your values. You've just unknowingly rerouted them. This is how good people do terrible things. Not because they abandon morality, but because their sense of morality gets redirected. Bent around a single powerful word, a word that distorts meaning, collapses complexity, and rewrites intent. And it works precisely because you don't feel manipulated. You feel principled. It feels like clarity, like strength, like standing up for what's right. The discomfort disappears. The hesitation fades. You stop seeing a person and start seeing a symbol. Now imagine it happening to you. Imagine someone assigning a word to you. Something small, maybe unstable, maybe threatening, maybe other. They don't need to prove it. They just say it, and it spreads quietly, slowly, until people who once knew you start to see something different. You'll notice it first in how they pause before speaking, in how they watch you more closely, in how they justify things they wouldn't have tolerated before. All of it reinforced by one word, used enough times to seem true. You don't have to change. You just have to be redefined. Language is supposed to help us understand the world, but it also helps us escape it. A single word can take a person with a name, a face, a history, and reduce them to a threat, a problem, a cost. And when that happens, morality becomes flexible, because the weight of the decision no longer feels personal. You think you're too smart for this, too aware, but it doesn't require ignorance. It only requires repetition, familiarity, gradual exposure to new definitions until you forget what you believed before. You don't need to be convinced, just nudged, slightly, repeatedly. The most dangerous part isn't that language can be used to control you. It's that it can make you feel like you're in control, like your actions are your own, like you came to these conclusions yourself, when in truth your moral compass has been hijacked so gently you never even noticed. And once it happens, you'll defend it, passionately, because now your identity is tied to it. To challenge the word would mean questioning yourself, your integrity, your past decisions. So you dig in deeper, not because you're certain, but because you're afraid to admit how easily certainty can be manufactured. This is the uncomfortable truth. Your morality isn't fixed. It's not a shield. It can be bent, shaped, redirected without force, without coercion. Just language, just context, just the right word said at the right time, by the right voice. And if that's true, you have to ask yourself something you may not want to answer. What word would it take to make you betray your values? And would you even recognize it when it happens? Have you ever noticed how the people who are the most certain are often the ones who should be questioned the most? There's something disarming about confidence. When someone speaks with complete conviction, when their voice doesn't waver and their eyes don't flinch, it becomes hard to doubt them. Even if what they're saying feels wrong, part of you hesitates. You second-guess yourself. You wonder if maybe they know something you don't. That's the trick. Confidence creates the illusion of truth. But consider this, real knowledge tends to come with hesitation. People who truly understand how complex something is don't speak in absolutes. They pause, they admit doubt, they qualify their claims, because they know how easily they could be wrong. They've seen how often certainty turns out to be misplaced. The more someone learns, the more they see how much they don't know. But the opposite is also true. People who know very little often feel the most sure. They don't see the complexity. They don't see the contradictions, so they fill in the gaps with confidence. Then we reward them for it. We hire confident candidates. We vote for confident leaders. We trust confident doctors, lawyers, scientists, teachers, because confidence feels like competence, even when it's not. Think about that carefully. Our instincts are wired to trust the very trait that should make us suspicious. We mistake boldness for credibility, self-assurance for accuracy, and that makes us vulnerable. Because the more confident someone is, the less feedback they receive. People don't challenge them. They're treated as authorities, so their beliefs go untested. Their mistakes go unnoticed. Their certainty grows while their accuracy shrinks. And they don't know it. Over time, they stop questioning themselves entirely. They believe their own performance. They speak not just as if they're right, but as if they can't be wrong. This is when they become dangerous. Not because they're evil or malicious, but because they're sure, unshakably sure, about things that no one should be sure of. And when you question them, they won't say, "I don't know." They won't admit uncertainty. They'll double down. They'll make you feel foolish for doubting them. They'll turn your hesitation into a weakness. And if you're not careful, you'll start to believe them. Not because they're right, but because they feel right. That's how people are led astray. Not by liars, necessarily, but by people who believe in themselves too much. Who mistake their confidence for clarity. Who never stop to ask if they might be wrong. And maybe that includes you. Think back. Can you remember a time when you felt completely sure of something, only to find out later you were wrong? How did it feel? Did you admit it quickly? Or did you try to defend yourself, even after the evidence changed? Confidence is addictive. Once you've felt the power of being certain, it's hard to let go of. It becomes part of your identity. You start to measure your value by how sure you sound. But the truth is, most things worth knowing come wrapped in uncertainty. The more honest a person is, the more likely they are to say, "I'm not sure." The more you've thought deeply about something, the less likely you are to speak about it with total confidence. And that's what makes this idea so uncomfortable. Because it means you can't trust your instincts about who to believe. The people who sound the most convincing might be the least trustworthy. The quiet voices, the hesitant thinkers, the ones who admit their uncertainty, those might be the ones telling the truth. But you don't want that to be true. You want the world to be simple. You want the loudest voice to be the right one. You want confidence to mean accuracy, because it makes everything easier. You don't want to have to sit in doubt. You don't want to constantly question the people who sound the most sure. It's exhausting. It's inconvenient. But that's the price of truth. And the deeper you go, the more disturbing it becomes. Because now you have to look at every confident person in your life, every leader, every teacher, every expert, and ask yourself a simple, unsettling question. Are they sure because they're right, or because they've stopped asking? And if they've stopped asking, why haven't you? Because the moment you stop questioning someone's certainty, you've already started to believe in something that might be false. Not because it's well reasoned, but because it's well delivered. Because it feels good to be led by someone who never hesitates. Because it's easier to follow confidence than to live with doubt. But the people worth listening to aren't always the ones who speak the loudest. They're the ones who pause, who choose their words carefully, who admit they don't know. And maybe the real danger isn't in being misled, it's in discovering how much you wanted to be. What if what you see right now is already a lie? Not because someone is trying to deceive you, not because there's a glitch in the system, but because your mind is constantly rewriting the world before you ever get the chance to see it clearly. You don't experience reality. You experience a version of it, edited, compressed, and heavily filtered. And you've been calling this distortion clarity. Your brain doesn't show you everything. It shows you what it decides matters. Millions of signals flood your senses every second, and almost all of them are discarded. You never notice. You assume what remains is the truth. But what if it's not? What if the story your mind builds is less about what's real and more about what's manageable? You don't see the full room. You see a version your attention can handle. You don't hear every sound. You hear what your brain tags as important. Your memories aren't perfect records. They're reconstructions, distorted more each time you recall them. Each emotion you feel is shaped by past experiences you've mostly forgotten. And still, you trust it all. You look out at the world and say, I know what's happening. But you don't. What you call awareness is actually a narrative, a useful fiction that keeps you functional, and it works until it doesn't. Until something breaks through, a contradiction you can't explain, a moment that doesn't fit the story. And then you feel it, the quiet dread of realizing that your grip on reality was never as firm as you thought. Think of how often you misremember events, convinced of details that never existed. Think of how easily your mood can color your judgment, how fear can distort your sense of time, how expectations can blind you to what's actually there. Your mind does all this in the background, constantly, without your permission. And it tells you this is clarity. But what if this clarity is actually the most dangerous illusion? It gives you confidence. It convinces you that you're objective, that your perspective is reliable, and that confidence becomes armor, shielding you from doubt, from humility, from the possibility that you might be wrong. You start to trust the version of reality you've constructed more than reality itself. That's when things get dangerous, because the mind that edits reality also edits morality. It filters out contradictions, justifies inconsistencies, erases inconvenient truths. You become the hero in every memory, the victim in every conflict, the one who saw things clearly while others were confused. And you believe it, not because it's true, but because your brain needs it to be. Now imagine someone else challenges your perspective, not with hostility, just with difference. A version of reality that doesn't match yours. You feel the resistance instantly, not to their idea, but to the possibility that your version might be incomplete. That's not just discomfort, it's threat. Because if your clarity fails here, where else has it failed? You start to understand why people double down on false beliefs, even in the face of evidence. Why they defend contradictions, even when they can't explain them. It's not stupidity or stubbornness, it's survival. If the mind admits too much distortion, the entire narrative might collapse. And without that narrative, what are you left with? So the mind keeps editing, keeps simplifying, smoothing over cracks, filling in gaps. It tells you that you understand, even when you don't. It gives you closure, even when the story is still unfolding, and you accept it. Because certainty feels safer than confusion, even if the certainty is built on lies. But what if you stop trusting that voice in your head? Not silenced it, just questioned it. What if you noticed every time it filled in a blank, explained away an error, painted someone else in the worst possible light? What if you saw your own thoughts not as truth, but as attempts, drafts, versions? you might start to see how fragile your version of reality really is. How many edits had to happen for your clarity to emerge? And then you'd feel something worse than doubt. You'd feel grief, because the version of you that believed in its own objectivity, that version would have to die, and in its place, something else would emerge. Not certainty, not clarity, just awareness of the distortion. A kind of quiet, permanent uncertainty. You'd have to live with that. Make peace with it. Accept that you will never see reality as it is, only as your mind permits you to. And maybe that's the most disturbing truth of all, that every time you felt most certain, most right, most clear, that was when the editing was most complete. When your mind had removed just enough of the world to make you feel like you understood it, and you believed it. Every time, without hesitation. What if you've never actually made a choice? What if every decision you've ever claimed as yours, every moment you felt certain, conflicted, or brave, was just the delayed recognition of something that had already begun, something already in motion, before you noticed? Think of the last important choice you made. Not something trivial, but something that felt like it mattered. A job, a relationship, a lie you told, a truth you revealed. At the time it felt deliberate. You weighed the options, you hesitated, you convinced yourself. And then, finally, you acted. But what if that final moment wasn't when the decision was made? What if the outcome had already been decided, not by logic or willpower, but by a chain of influences you didn't notice? What if your reasons were just stories you told afterward, explanations designed to make it feel like the choice was ever yours? There's evidence to suggest it. Neuroscience shows that the brain initiates action before you become aware of your intent. A tiny signal, milliseconds before you choose, starts the process. By the time you think you've made up your mind, the mechanism is already underway. You're not choosing, you're catching up. And still, the feeling of agency persists. It's strong, convincing, because without it, everything becomes terrifying. If you didn't choose your past actions, then what about the ones you're about to make? If your hands moved before your mind approved, then what part of you is responsible for what you've done? You can try to hold on. You can say free will is complex, that influences aren't the same as causes. But when every thought, every impulse, every hesitation is shaped by something, your genetics, your environment, your trauma, your conditioning, what's left that's truly free? Maybe nothing. Maybe what we call free will is just a delay, a gap between cause and recognition, between impulse and awareness. You don't steer the ship, you just realize where it's going and tell yourself you meant to go there, and if that's true, then accountability becomes murky. You want to believe in punishment, in reward, in guilt and redemption. But how do you judge someone for choices they were always going to make? How do you forgive someone who never had the power to do differently? It gets worse when you turn it inward. Think of your worst mistakes, the ones you replay late at night, the ones that still tighten your chest when you think about them. Were they choices or inevitabilities? If you were shaped to break in that exact way, at that exact time, what does remorse even mean? Maybe regret is just your consciousness catching up too late. Even your efforts to change are suspect. You tell yourself you're learning, improving, but the urge to improve, where did that come from? The discomfort with who you were, what caused that? You didn't choose the shame, you didn't choose the clarity, they just appeared. And still, you try, you act. You struggle with decisions, believing they matter, believing you are choosing. But deep down, in quieter moments, you sense something else. That your thoughts are just echoes. That your motives are inherited. That what you do next has already started, even if you don't know it yet. You delay the truth because it's unbearable. If there's no free will, then your whole life becomes a kind of performance. Not in the theatrical sense, but in the mechanical one. Inputs and outputs. A complex system responding to stimuli. A story unfolding without an author. And yet, you still feel the weight of it. The guilt, the pride, the fear of doing the wrong thing. You live as if your choices matter, even if they don't. Because to stop pretending would collapse something essential, something fragile. But what if the pretending is what traps you? You're not free, you never were. The only freedom you have is how long you wait before realizing that. How long you delay the admission. How long you tell yourself, I chose this, even as something deeper pulls the strings. There is no free will, only delays. Would you rather be guilty of something you didn't do or admit that you're not special? Most people believe they'd never confess to a crime they didn't commit. They say it with certainty, like it's a fact about who they are, but false confessions happen. A lot, and not just under torture. Not just in extreme conditions. People confess during normal interrogations, after hours of pressure, isolation and suggestion. They begin to doubt themselves. They get worn down. They start to believe that the fastest way out is through guilt. Now compare that to something else, asking someone to honestly accept that they're average, that their intelligence, their talents, their life are all unremarkable. That if you place them in a room with 100 strangers, there would be nothing that sets them apart. Not in any meaningful way. People resist that with more force than they resist guilt. They'd rather believe they were misunderstood, unlucky, sabotaged. They'll rewrite their own story rather than accept mediocrity. Because mediocrity doesn't just feel boring, it feels like erasure. When you're accused of a crime you didn't commit, you're still the center of the story. You're still someone of interest. People are looking at you, thinking about you. You matter, but to be average is to disappear, to become one of many, replaceable, invisible. And that's unbearable in a different way. It's quieter, slower, but deeper. So when someone's under pressure, when their mind is breaking down, they sometimes find it easier to say, yes, I did it, than to say, no, I'm nobody. Because guilt implies you had power, that you affected the world, that something happened because of you. Even if it's terrible, it means you mattered. But average means you don't. You weren't the best student. You weren't the worst. You weren't especially kind or cruel. You just passed through things without leaving a mark. And that, more than guilt, more than punishment, is what people are afraid of. It's why people chase success long after they've stopped enjoying what they do. Why they tell stories that exaggerate their past. Why they post things online that make their lives seem bigger than they are. They're not always trying to impress others. Sometimes they're trying to convince themselves that their life is unique, that they're not forgettable. Even in court, in prisons, among people who've confessed to horrifying things, there's often a strange sense of identity. I did something. I mattered. You see it in their eyes. You hear it in their words. They describe their crime in detail. They relive it over and over because it makes them feel real. Meanwhile, the average person, living a quiet, unremarkable life, doesn't get that. They can go decades without ever feeling truly seen. And when they do look in the mirror, they wonder what they've actually done. What part of the world would be different if they'd never been born? And when the answer feels like not much, something cracks, so they exaggerate. They cling to stories where they were the victim or the hero. They create villains in their life to feel like the protagonist. They imagine injustices that make their pain more meaningful. Sometimes they even imagine guilt that makes their suffering feel deserved, because pain without meaning is unbearable. But pain with a story That's something the mind can hold. It's why people confess to crimes they didn't commit. Not just to end the interrogation, but because some part of them wants to be punished, wants to be noticed, wants to be significant. Because in a world where most people are average, invisibility feels worse than guilt. And the mind, when pushed hard enough, would rather live with a lie that makes it special than a truth that makes it forgettable. Even if that lie ruins your life. Even if it's a confession that was never true. How many of the people you admire, most politicians, CEOs, media personalities, would you describe as deeply empathetic, not polite, not well-spoken, not charitable, empathetic? The kind of person who feels the weight of another person's pain as if it were their own. Now ask yourself something more uncomfortable. How many of those same people would you describe as coldly strategic, socially dominant, persuasive, relentless? That pattern isn't random. High-functioning sociopaths, the ones who don't end up in prison, often end up in power, not in spite of their lack of empathy, but because of it. Their charm is real, but it's instrumental. It serves a purpose, not connection. Control. They know how to read people, how to mirror emotions, how to say exactly what someone wants to hear, not out of kindness, but calculation. It looks like warmth. It feels like trust, but it's just design. They move through rooms like hunters, watching, measuring, testing reactions. They're not burdened by guilt or shame the way others are. So they make faster decisions, take bigger risks, push harder, manipulate more effectively. Not because they're evil, but because they're not tethered. And in systems built around competition, politics, business, media, that becomes an advantage. The ability to lie convincingly, to charm without conscience, to exploit without hesitation. It doesn't disqualify someone, it promotes them. People want to believe the most charismatic person in the room is also the most sincere. They want to feel safe with power. They want to be led by someone who seems confident, certain, unshakable. But confidence without conscience isn't leadership. It's predation. And the deeper you look, the more you notice how often success in these systems depends not on who is most moral, but on who is least disturbed by moral compromise. They smile, they inspire, they say all the right things. But something feels missing when you look too long. Some part of them isn't really there. They're good at eye contact, but the connection doesn't land. It's like speaking to a mask that never quite blinks. What's disturbing isn't just that they exist, it's how much people want them to lead. How quickly people silence their own discomfort in exchange for confidence and control. How easily they excuse cruelty when it's framed as strength. And the charm doesn't just hide what's missing, it hides how much they're studying you. Learning your desires, your weaknesses, your blind spots, not to protect you, to use you, to get what they want with as little resistance as possible. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just efficient, but it's always cold. There's no inner conflict, no wrestling with conscience, just outcomes, just strategy. And if you confront it, if you call it out, you'll sound paranoid, bitter, jealous. People want to believe they've chosen their leaders wisely. They don't want to hear that they were manipulated, that the warmth they felt was engineered. That's why this idea is so difficult to face. Because it doesn't just ask whether sociopaths exist in positions of power. It asks whether they belong there, whether their very lack of empathy is exactly what made them effective. Whether on some level, people unconsciously chose them because of it. And if that's true, what does it say about everyone else? The people who follow, support, celebrate them. What does it say about you? Have you ever felt drawn to someone powerful, only to realize later they never actually cared about you? Have you ever excused someone's cruelty because you admired their success? Have you ever felt safer under someone who frightened you a little? You can't always spot them right away. They don't fit the caricature. They don't rant or rage. They smile. They flatter. They shake your hand firmly and remember your name. And somewhere inside, you feel a strange confusion. Part of you wants to trust them. Part of you feels afraid. And the worst part is, those two parts don't cancel each other out. They feed each other. Because charm without empathy doesn't build trust. It builds dependence. And once you've stepped into that dynamic, it's hard to see clearly. You mistake control for care, certainty for wisdom. You give them power, and in return, they give you the illusion of safety. And even now, knowing this, you might still feel reluctant to pull away, to look more closely, to ask whether someone you admire might not actually feel anything at all when they hurt others. Because if you admit that, you have to confront something darker, not just about them, about the world that rewards them, about yourself and the people you've trusted. And maybe that's the real reason sociopaths rise so easily, because most people would rather believe a comforting lie than face the emptiness behind the smile. Who do you really care about? Someone in pain or someone who reminds you of yourself? It's a difficult question to answer honestly. Most people don't think in those terms. They imagine empathy as a natural, unbiased force, a kind of moral instinct that activates when someone suffers. But if you pay attention, really watch yourself in quiet moments, you might notice something else. You don't feel for everyone equally. You don't respond to suffering in proportion to its severity. You respond to familiarity. A stranger cries in the street, and you feel uneasy, not because they're hurting, but because you don't know how to place them. Their pain is distant, vague. But someone speaks with your voice, your mannerisms, your insecurities cloaked in different language, and suddenly you feel a rush of understanding. Not because their pain is deeper, not because their need is greater, but because it reflects something you recognize. This is the part most people don't admit. Empathy isn't always generous. It's selective. It doesn't flow to those who need it most. It flows to those who resemble you most. You feel more for people who think like you, look like you, move through the world like you. People whose mistakes you can imagine making. People whose fears feel familiar. You see a parent struggling to raise a child, and your sympathy deepens if you've struggled too. You hear about someone falling into addiction, and if you've never felt that pull, it's easier to stay silent. But if you've stood on that same edge, the empathy arrives effortlessly. It feels noble. It isn't. It's recognition. You're not connecting to their pain. You're connecting to yourself through their pain. This is why some suffering stays invisible. People who move differently, believe differently, act in ways you can't understand. They don't mirror you. Their struggle feels foreign. And so your empathy stutters, not because you're cruel, because you're unfamiliar. And yet you tell yourself that you care about humanity, about justice, about compassion. But when someone desperate begs in a voice you can't relate to, or suffers in a way you find confusing or even repellent, something inside you withdraws, quietly, automatically. You don't even notice it happening. You might still act kind, you might still offer help, but your empathy, your felt sense of connection, never truly ignites. It waits, dormant, until someone familiar appears again. Then it flares. Then you feel moved. The contradiction deepens when you try to fix it. When you try to stretch your empathy toward those who don't resemble you. You might do it out of guilt, out of obligation. But it's not the same. It's effortful, constructed, thin, and you sense it. You know deep down that the feeling isn't real, it's a performance of morality, a reenactment of concern, and it leaves you exhausted because true empathy doesn't feel like work. It feels like recognition, like looking in a mirror and seeing someone else's face. And this leads to something more disturbing. If empathy is rooted in self-recognition, then your compassion is limited by your identity. You help those who reinforce who you are. You give most freely to those who validate your self-image. And you ignore, sometimes without meaning to, the people who challenge it. Which means empathy isn't always moral. Sometimes it's narcissistic. Sometimes the person who needs you most will receive nothing from you, not because you don't care, but because you don't recognize yourself in them. You don't feel the pull, and so you pass them by. Even worse, you might empathize more with the person doing harm than the one being harmed. If the aggressor looks like you, sounds like you, shares your fears or background, you might explain their behavior, excuse it, soften it. Meanwhile, the victim, if they're unfamiliar, if their experience feels alien, you hesitate, you stay neutral, you question their story, and you don't realize you're doing it. You tell yourself you're being fair, you're being objective, but often you're just protecting your sense of identity. This is why empathy can fail, why entire groups can be ignored, why some people live and die in silence, while others are mourned loudly, passionately, endlessly, not because their pain was greater, but because more people saw themselves in them. And now you're faced with a quiet, difficult question. If your empathy depends on recognition, what happens when no one recognizes you? When your pain doesn't reflect anyone else's? When your suffering feels alien to those around you? Will they still care, or will they respond the way you sometimes do? Distant, polite, unconvinced. That's the fear no one says out loud. That the empathy you rely on isn't based on need. It's based on resemblance. And if you ever become too strange, too different, too hard to relate to, you'll be left behind. Not because they hate you, but because you no longer mirror them. And just like that, you begin to see that empathy isn't a light in the dark. It's a mirror in the fog. And some people never get seen at all. How many times can you say something before it stops meaning anything? Not to others, to yourself. You say the words again and again because they're true. You believe in them. You want to remember. You want to hold on. But slowly, something begins to shift. The first time you spoke them, they carried weight. They cut through you. They rearranged something inside. But the second time, they echoed. The third, they softened. And by the 10th, they felt more like background noise than truth. It's not that the words changed, it's that you did. You got used to them. This is the quiet decay of truth, not through lies, not through censorship, but through repetition. The erosion doesn't come from disagreement. It comes from familiarity and eventually from boredom. You see it everywhere. In apologies repeated too often, promises echoed year after year, warnings shouted until they're ignored. Even the most profound truths, when said enough times, become invisible. Not because they're less true, but because you've stopped listening. The mind craves novelty, contrast, intensity. It doesn't know how to hold the same idea in reverence forever. It adapts, adjusts, numbs itself. And the more often something is repeated, the less urgently it feels like it needs to be heard. That's the strange paradox. To preserve a truth, you have to risk it being forgotten. You have to let it rest. Let it go quiet. Let people rediscover it for themselves. But we rarely do that. We repeat it louder, more often, desperately trying to keep it alive. We drown it in noise. Consider how this happens inside you. A belief you held with conviction, a value you once thought unshakable. You reminded yourself constantly, you repeated it to others, you turned it into a mantra. But over time, it started feeling hollow. You began to question if you ever believed it at all, not because it became false, but because it became familiar. There's a kind of fatigue that sets in when you hear the same truth too many times. It stops feeling urgent. It stops cutting. And eventually it becomes invisible. Worse, the repetition can backfire. The more you insist on something, the more others question your motives. Are you trying to convince them or yourself? Do you repeat it because it's true or because you're afraid it might not be? You start to see this dynamic everywhere. Political slogans, moral imperatives, cultural values, all repeated endlessly until they become detached from meaning. People still say them, but no one listens. No one changes. The words become decorations, empty markers, symbols of identity, not expressions of truth. And you wonder, does anyone even remember what they meant? The most disturbing part is that this erosion happens slowly, quietly. You don't notice it at first. You say the words with the same tone, the same conviction, but something's missing. The edge is gone, the urgency has dulled, and you start to feel disconnected, like you're speaking someone else's truth. Then comes the doubt. If the truth no longer moves you, does that mean it was never real? If saying it out loud brings no comfort, no clarity, was it ever yours? Maybe it still is. Maybe repetition doesn't destroy truth. Maybe it just changes your relationship to it, makes it harder to feel, but no less true. Or maybe it reveals that what you called truth was really just belief, and belief requires emotion. Belief needs to feel alive, otherwise it withers. You're left with a choice. Let the truth fade quietly, trusting that it will return when it's needed, or keep repeating it, knowing that every repetition brings it closer to being ignored. It's not easy to choose silence, especially when the truth feels urgent. But sometimes silence is the only way to preserve what matters. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop speaking. And now you see the cost of repetition, not in the words themselves, but in what they lose. The weight, the sharpness, the ability to move you. The more you say them, the less they live. Not because they're wrong, but because you've stopped feeling them. What if I told you your mind can be changed without you noticing, not through debate, not through evidence, but quietly, invisibly, through repetition, emotion, and fatigue? That you could wake up tomorrow believing something you never agreed to and feel like you always have. It sounds impossible. You want to believe your thoughts are your own, that your beliefs come from reason, reflection, insight. But how often do you truly trace a thought back to its source? Do you remember where it began, or do you just find yourself thinking it one day and accept that as natural? The truth is, your brain isn't designed to protect your beliefs. It's designed to adapt, to learn, to imitate, to survive. And survival doesn't demand accuracy. It demands conformity, predictability, social cohesion. If everyone around you repeats a message often enough, your mind begins to adopt it, not because it's true, but because it's safer. You don't feel the change. You don't get a warning. There's no alarm when a false belief slips in. It feels exactly the same as the ones you earned. Most people think brainwashing is rare, that it only happens in cults, in prisons, in extreme situations. But the mechanisms are everywhere. Repetition, isolation, authority, emotional manipulation, shame. Once you understand how they work, you start seeing them all around you, on your phone, in your workplace, in your family, in yourself. You see how easy it is to believe something just because it feels good. just because it relieves anxiety, just because it fits. That's the trick. Beliefs don't have to be true. They just have to feel right. And the more often they're repeated, especially by people you trust, the more right they feel. Eventually, they stop feeling like beliefs at all. They just become reality, even when they're not. Think about this. When was the last time you changed your mind because of evidence alone? Not pressure, not fear, not emotion, just facts. And if that almost never happens, then what does that say about the way your mind works? About what actually causes belief? Now consider how vulnerable you are when you're tired, distracted, lonely, in pain. Your defenses drop. You stop questioning. You absorb more than you realize. The things you laugh at, the things you scroll past, the things you hear without listening. They don't vanish. They echo, quietly, repeatedly. And each time they carve just a little deeper. Until one day you notice a belief you never chose. A reaction you never questioned. An opinion you can't explain. And it feels like it came from you, but it didn't. This is what makes brainwashing so terrifying. It doesn't feel like coercion. It feels like clarity. You don't feel manipulated. You feel certain. You feel awake. But that certainty is the illusion. You've probably already been told what to think about brainwashing. That only weak-minded people fall for it. That you'd know if it happened to you. But that belief is part of the trap. The more confident you are in your immunity, the more vulnerable you become. Because the best kind of manipulation never announces itself. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It waits. It mimics your own voice. And the scariest part, it works even when you know how it works. You can read every book on influence, study every trick, but when the pressure's high enough, when you're scared, ashamed, or alone, you'll believe whatever brings relief. Not because you're weak, but because you're human. That's all it takes. You don't need to be isolated, or hypnotized, or tortured. You just need to be uncertain long enough. And once the seed is planted, your brain does the rest. It protects it, justifies it, builds your identity around it, until pulling it out feels like tearing off your own skin. That's how belief works. It anchors itself. It becomes who you are. So now the question isn't whether you've been brainwashed. It's how many times, how many thoughts you carry that were planted, not chosen, how many fears you inherited, how many judgments you absorbed, how much of you isn't really you. Because the real danger of brainwashing isn't that it happens. It's that when it does, you'll never feel it. You'll feel safe, confident, certain. And you'll go to sleep every night convinced your mind is your own, when maybe it never really was. What if every moral rule you follow, every line you refuse to cross, isn't really yours? What if it was written long before you were born, not by gods or truths, but by people you'll never meet, people who are already dead? Think about how morality feels. Not like a choice, but like an inheritance. You're taught right and wrong as a child, long before you understand what those words even mean. You absorb them through glances, warnings, silence. They're not explained, they're expected. You grow up believing some acts are sacred, others unforgivable. But where did those beliefs come from? Not from reason, not from experience, from repetition, from approval, from punishment, and mostly from the dead. You've never met the people who decided what should make you feel ashamed, but their ideas shape your guilt, your silence, your decisions. When you hesitate to act, when you flinch from the edge of a taboo, you're not listening to your own voice. You're obeying ghosts. This isn't just about religion or tradition. Even your secular ethics, your modern principles, are built on foundations you didn't lay. Civil rights, justice, equality. They feel progressive, but they're still inherited. Developed by others, embedded over generations, passed down through books, laws, social rituals. You think you're acting freely, but most of your moral reactions happen before you even think. Automatic, programmed. You feel disgust, outrage, pride without knowing why. You say things are wrong, not because you've reasoned it out, but because you've never questioned who taught you that. And when you do question it, what happens? You feel afraid, not of violence or punishment, but of social exile, of being seen as broken, twisted, evil. Because morality isn't just peer pressure, it's ancestral pressure. It's the accumulated will of everyone who came before you, pushing silently against your choices. They're not here anymore, but they still speak, through your conscience, through your fear, through your shame. You carry them in your thoughts, like judges you can't see. This raises a disturbing possibility. Maybe morality is less about truth and more about survival. A set of behaviors that kept ancient groups stable, customs that helped tribes grow, kept bloodlines intact, ensured cooperation. What made a group survive became what made a person good. What threatened the group became evil. And once those judgments were set, they calcified. They stuck. Long after the circumstances changed, the rules remained. The reasons were forgotten, but the commands survived. So now, when you say this is wrong, are you describing the world, or just echoing what kept someone else alive? It feels noble to follow a moral code. It feels righteous. But what if it's just submission, not to a god, not to a law, but to the quiet voices of people long dead, whispering that you must obey or be cast out? You've inherited rules about sexuality, violence, family, loyalty. You didn't choose them. You were taught to fear the consequences of breaking them. You were taught that guilt is virtue, that shame is proof of conscience. But is that morality, or just conditioning? And here's where it becomes even more unsettling. Imagine you were born in a different place, in a different century. You'd believe different things. You'd feel guilt for different actions. You'd feel pride in choices you now find abhorrent. Your moral instincts would feel just as strong, but they'd point in opposite directions. That means your morality isn't universal. It's geographical, historical, contingent. So what does that say about the choices you make now? When you tell yourself you're being good, or kind, or just, are you sure it's not just habit? Are you sure it's not just fear of disappointing people who aren't even alive anymore? Maybe that's what conscience really is. Not a compass, a leash, a tool used by the dead to shape the living, to keep their vision of order intact, to ensure their values outlive their bodies. A kind of psychological afterlife, not for their souls, but for their influence. You've never asked to carry their weight, but you do, every day. Every time you hesitate, every time you suppress an impulse, deny a desire, choose the right thing. You think you're being moral, but maybe you're just being obedient. And if that's true, then the most moral act you could commit might be the one that makes you feel most ashamed. The one that breaks the script. The one that silences the voices. But even now, you hesitate, because the leash is still there. Tight, quiet, invisible. Pulled by hands that turned to dust long ago. Imagine the person you love most in the world. Not just a friend, not an acquaintance, someone whose absence would tear something permanent out of you. Now picture the most painful moment of your life. The rawest wound, the one you don't talk about. Which one comes to mind faster? Love leaves a mark, but pain leaves a scar. Think of your memories, the ones you revisit in silence, the ones that rise up without warning. How many are joyful? How many are soaked in fear, regret, or humiliation? You want to believe that joy is what shapes you. But when you look back, what actually returns with vivid clarity? The hand that held yours, or the one that let go? This isn't about cynicism. It's about structure, about how your mind encodes survival. Pain isn't just felt, it's stored. Your nervous system learns from it, adapts, prioritizes it. Because pleasure doesn't threaten you, but pain teaches you what to avoid, who to fear, when to run. It imprints. You may forget the warmth of an embrace, but you never forget the feeling of being left. And maybe that's why people who hurt you linger in your memory longer than those who loved you. Because love is often soft, ambient, dispersed over time. But pain condenses, it sharpens moments into permanence. One sentence spoken in anger can replay for decades. One betrayal can override years of loyalty. That it gets stranger. Because sometimes you don't even want to remember. You resist it. You bury it. But pain works in silence. It seeps into the architecture of your choices. Who you trust. What you avoid. What makes you flinch. You think you're being rational, but you're just staying away from the last thing that broke you. Love doesn't work like that. Love is voluntary. It's gentle, unstable, easily fractured. It needs maintenance. It needs belief. Pain doesn't need anything. Once it enters, it stays. So what does that say about the people you've lost? You might think the ones who loved you the most would be the hardest to forget. But sometimes they fade slowly, unfairly, while the people who caused the most damage stay vivid. Not because you care more, but because pain doesn't allow erasure. It preserves itself. And that creates a contradiction inside you. You say you want peace, but your mind keeps circling the wound, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it never felt safe again. Because part of you still thinks understanding it might prevent it from happening again, as if enough analysis could undo what happened. But it can't. Pain doesn't bargain. And here's where it gets even harder. Sometimes the person who hurt you also loved you. Sometimes love and pain arrive in the same body, same voice, same touch. And now the memory becomes warped, unstable. You want to keep the love, you want to erase the pain, but they're fused, and you can't pull them apart without destroying both. That's why some people never leave you. Not because you miss them, but because your brain filed them under danger, and it won't let you forget. Even if you beg it to, you tell yourself you're over it, that you're fine, that it's in the past. But your reflexes say otherwise. The way you second-guess compliments, the way you tense up when someone raises their voice, the way you prepare for abandonment, even when no one's leaving. That isn't personality, that's residue. And the worst part is, you might have done this to someone else. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but carelessly, in a moment of fear or anger or selfishness. You might live gently now, but someone out there remembers you only through the lens of their worst day, their most painful hour. You live on in their nervous system as a warning. That's what pain does. It makes people unforgettable in the worst way. And so we keep saying that love is what matters most. That love is what holds us together. But look at your memories. The ones that replay when you're trying to fall asleep. The ones that make your chest tighten, your jaw clench. Do they belong to love or pain? You might say both, but which one made you who you are? Not who you hoped to become. Not your ideals, but your instincts, your habits, the private logic you live by when no one is watching. What shaped that? It wasn't love, it was the thing you swore you'd never go through again. And that's why pain survives longer than love. Because love is soft, and pain is armor. Love asks you to open. Pain teaches you to close. And once you've closed, even love has trouble getting in. And maybe, if you're honest, you're not trying to forget the people who hurt you. You're just waiting for someone to love you enough that the pain finally starts to fade. But the body doesn't forget what it learned to protect. And sometimes, even in safety, it still lives like it's under threat. What if the worst thought you've ever had didn't come from you? Not something you whispered to yourself in a moment of anger. Not something born from childhood trauma or buried shame. Just a thought. A sentence, a picture, appearing suddenly, fully formed in your mind, as if it had always been there, waiting, but it wasn't yours. You didn't make it. You didn't choose it. And yet you feel responsible for it. People talk about intrusive thoughts like they're harmless, random mental noise, static. But when it's dark and you're alone and something terrible slips into your mind, you don't feel neutral. You feel sick. You feel guilty. You wonder where it came from, what it means, what it says about you. Maybe it's an image of someone you love getting hurt. Maybe it's a desire you'd never admit out loud. Maybe it's violent, sexual, cruel. And even if it vanishes in a second, even if you never act on it, you still carry the shame like a bruise. You didn't ask for the thought. You didn't agree to it. But somehow, you feel like you did. There's something strange about the way we relate to our own minds. When a good thought appears, an idea, a memory, a plan, we take credit for it. We believe we created it, controlled it. But when something dark arises, we freeze. We pretend we didn't think it. We try to bury it, forget it. And the more we try, the more power it seems to have. No one else knows. No one can see inside your mind, but the thought lingers. You keep returning to it, not because you want to, but because you can't stop wondering if it's revealing something about who you really are. You start to believe that having the thought is the same as wanting it, that maybe you're dangerous, broken, secretly evil. And in trying to convince yourself otherwise, you only make it worse. The more you fight the thought, the more real it feels. The more shame you feel, the more the thought repeats. A loop you can't escape. And then something even more unsettling happens. You realize you're not alone. Everyone has thoughts like these. Sudden, strange, unwanted impulses. You read about them, hear others confess them, and for a moment that brings comfort. You feel less isolated, less monstrous. But then you feel something worse, a quiet dread. If everyone has these thoughts, why do they matter so much to you? Why do they feel so specific, so personal, so targeted? Maybe they aren't random at all. Maybe they're revealing something deeper, something true. You start to look for patterns. You obsess over meaning. You scan your own mind like it's a crime scene. Every stray idea becomes evidence. Every memory is suspect. You can't trust your own brain, can't trust your intentions, can't trust what might come next. So you become cautious, hyper-vigilant. You censor yourself, even in silence. You rehearse what not to think. You build walls around your own mind, but thoughts are strange. They slip through cracks. They find ways in. And here's the part no one talks about. Sometimes you do act on them. Not all the way, not completely. But you say something passive-aggressive. You avoid someone. You indulge a little too long in something you shouldn't. And afterward, you tell yourself it was just stress, just a mistake. But you remember the thought that came before it. And suddenly, the line between fantasy and action feels thinner than it should. You try to regain control. Discipline your mind. Fight fire with fire. But the more control you try to have, the more unstable you feel. Like your own brain is working against you. Like your thoughts aren't just thoughts anymore, they're threats. And then comes the final collapse. You no longer believe your thoughts belong to you. They feel foreign, invasive. Like someone else is whispering through your mind, using your voice. But no one can prove otherwise. No one can see the battle happening inside you. And no one will take the blame when it spills out. So you do. You take the blame for every dark thought you didn't ask for. Every moment of doubt, envy, rage, every shameful image, every twisted desire. You own them completely. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is that your mind isn't yours anymore, and that thought is the most terrifying of all. What if the man drowning in front of you looked exactly like the person you hate most? Not similar, not vaguely reminiscent, but precise, every detail, every expression, every mannerism, the voice, the posture, the memory it triggers in your chest. It's him, or whoever it is that lives inside the part of you, still knotted with rage. Now imagine they're screaming, reaching, drowning, not a metaphor, not a thought experiment. It's happening, and only you are close enough to help. There's no one else around, no moral audience, no camera, no judgment. No one will ever know what you choose. Your hands, your decision, alone. So do you save them? The answer feels automatic. Of course you do, because you're better than your anger, because you're not like them, because you're not a killer. But that's just the voice you tell yourself. That's the performance you've practiced. That's the easy answer offered when there's no real consequence. Now, stay in the scene, watch them flail, listen to the desperation, look at their face. Remember everything they did, every word, every moment that made your stomach twist. Remember what they cost you, how long it took to heal, and now they're begging you, looking into your eyes, not with guilt, not with apology, just fear. And in that moment something happens. A thought, quiet but clear. If you let go, if you walk away, it would be so easy, so quick. Just a few seconds of silence, and then it's over. No one hurt you. No one lied. No one betrayed you. They're just gone. The feeling is quiet, not rage, not fire, just relief. The possibility of a world where they don't exist. And now you're faced with something worse than hatred. You're faced with indifference. You could save them, and you don't want to. Not because it's hard, not because you're scared, but because deep down, part of you believes they deserve it. So the question shifts. It's not about what they did, it's about what you are willing to become. If you walk away, what does that make you? Not a murderer, but something else. Something smaller, colder. Someone who let another human being die because it was convenient. But maybe you think, isn't that what they would have done? Isn't that how they lived? So why should you be better? And that's the real trap. The slow erosion of everything you believe about yourself. Not through violence, not through cruelty, but through quiet justification. You begin to realize that the choice isn't about them at all. It's about whether your morality survives when it's no longer rewarded, when no one is watching, when it costs you something, when it forces you to reach into the water and save someone you truly, honestly despise. And what if you do save them? What if they live and they never thank you, never change? What if they go on doing harm, as they always did? What if saving them brings more pain to others? Now it isn't just mercy, it's responsibility. You gave them another chance, and what they do with it, will that be on you? And then the thought appears, maybe it would be better for everyone if they just disappeared. Maybe you could live with that. Maybe the world would be cleaner, safer. Maybe it's not even about revenge. Maybe it's about balance. But that's how it begins. That's how the line shifts. One person you let die because they earned it. Another you ignore because you're tired. A third you overlook because you think they don't deserve help. Until eventually you stop checking who's in the water. You stop noticing altogether. That's the part that should unsettle you. Not the act of letting one man drown, but how easy it is to live with yourself afterward. Because once you've done it, once you've crossed that line, the silence becomes familiar. The emptiness no longer feels wrong, and the person you thought you were starts to feel like a stranger. Not because you changed suddenly, but because the moment revealed something that was already there. And now, even if you choose to save him, you'll always know how close you came. Every time you lie, something happens in your brain. Not just guilt, not just memory, something physical, tangible. Neurons shift, pathways rewire. You become, by definition, someone slightly different than before, but you don't feel it. You don't feel the change the first time you lie. Maybe it's small, maybe it's harmless. A convenient untruth, a soft edit of reality to avoid discomfort. You tell yourself it's justified, necessary, even. You might feel a flicker of discomfort, but it fades. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, that you'll stop, that you're still the same person, but your brain doesn't agree. It registers what you've done, the lie, the relief, the reward, and it adjusts. Slightly, imperceptibly. The pathway from anxiety to relief becomes shorter, smoother. Next time, the lie will come faster. Your brain is learning that deception works. And if the second lie works too, the pattern strengthens. You begin to need it, not for manipulation, not for gain, just to maintain the reality you've created. The false image, the edited self. And your brain supports this. It reinforces the shortcut. Each time you lie, it gets harder to tell the truth. Not because you're more dishonest, but because you're less equipped to be honest. You don't notice the shift right away, but eventually you forget how it felt to speak plainly. You forget what it was like to be transparent. Truth starts to feel risky, even when there's nothing to lose. Vulnerability feels dangerous. Exposure feels fatal. You don't mean to deceive. You just can't quite stop. You're not lying to gain something anymore. You're lying because the version of you that could stop no longer exists. And here's where it gets darker. The brain doesn't just reward lying, it adapts to it. Your sense of self becomes blurred. Your memory shifts. You start to believe fragments of the lies you told. The more you repeat them, the more they settle into your identity. You remember events differently. You justify choices that never happened. You craft stories that serve the image, not the facts. Eventually, even you can't tell the difference. And still, the lies continue. Not because you want them to, but because you need them. Because the structure you've built around yourself depends on them. Without them, things collapse. Relationships, roles, your own reflection. Telling the truth now would feel like a confession. A rupture, so you lie again. To preserve what the previous lies created. This is how addiction works. But instead of a substance, the addiction is self-preservation. You're not addicted to power or control. You're addicted to the version of yourself that exists only in fiction. And your brain, loyal and efficient, keeps helping. It strengthens the network, dulls the guilt, suppresses the conflict. It teaches you to survive inside the lie until something breaks. Someone sees through it. Or you slip, or the pressure becomes too much. And in that moment, you're forced to confront the full weight of what's been built. You see not just the lie, but the structure it supports. And the deeper horror is this. You realize you no longer know how to function without it. Telling the truth now isn't just difficult, it's dangerous. Not because of consequences, but because it would mean unraveling the person you've become. It would mean tearing down years of subtle changes, undoing neural pathways, shattering habits that have replaced honesty with performance. It would mean standing in front of someone, vulnerable, exposed, without the mask you've spent so long perfecting. And worse still, you'd have to admit that the mask wasn't just for others, it was for you. That you needed the lie to feel safe, that the truth was too unstable, too unpredictable, too real, so you keep lying. And you don't even call it that anymore. You call it boundaries, or privacy, or tact. You say you're protecting others, but deep down you know that's not true. You're protecting yourself from the raw terror of being seen clearly. You're protecting the fragile, carefully manufactured illusion that's now become your only sense of stability. And maybe that's the most disturbing part. You didn't become dishonest through malice. You didn't set out to deceive. You just made one small compromise. And your brain, eager to protect you, rewired itself to help. And now you're trapped, not in a lie, but in the version of yourself who needs lies to feel whole, to feel safe, to feel real. And you wonder, quietly, when the last time was that you told the truth and actually meant it. What if the false memory you carry is louder than the truth you forgot? Not just louder in sound, but louder in weight, louder in clarity, louder in the way it commands your certainty. You remember it with sharp edges, total confidence. You'd swear it happened. You'd stake your reputation on it. But it didn't. It never did. And the truth, the real, small, quiet truth, fades in comparison. Not because it's less important, not because it's less real, but because it doesn't repeat itself as often. It doesn't get echoed. It doesn't comfort you with familiarity. Most people don't think of memory as something that can betray them. They think of it like a camera, like a diary, like evidence. But memory isn't a record. It's a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you don't pull it from a vault, you rebuild it, piece by piece, with tools that are flawed, emotional, and easily manipulated. So when someone tells you something often enough, especially if it's said with confidence, your memory reshapes itself around it. The fake fact becomes the skeleton, and the truth becomes the soft tissue, fragile, easily torn, barely holding on. You might not notice it happening. It doesn't feel like forgetting. It feels like remembering more clearly. It feels like finally understanding. But what you're really remembering is the version of the story that was easiest to repeat, the one that made the most emotional sense, the one that fit into what you already wanted to believe. And this isn't just personal, it's collective. Entire societies remember the wrong things. Nations build themselves on stories that didn't happen. Leaders get re-elected because lies feel more satisfying than complicated truths. We celebrate heroes who never existed. We fear threats that never materialized. We punish people for things they didn't do because a fake memory echoed louder than any protest could. There's a reason fake facts spread faster. They're designed to. They're shaped for repetition, for simplicity, for emotional grip. The truth isn't shaped that way. It's slow. It's boring. It has too many disclaimers. It doesn't always tell you what you want to hear. And the more you hear the fake fact, the more real it becomes, not just in your mind, but in your behavior. You act on it. You vote based on it. You change your relationships around it. You start to treat people differently. And by then, the truth doesn't matter anymore. Even if someone could prove it, show you documents, recordings, data, you wouldn't feel it. It wouldn't resonate. It would seem weak, suspicious, almost offensive. Because by then, the lie isn't just a memory, it's part of your identity. To remove it would mean rewriting part of yourself. And very few people are willing to do that. It's easier to keep the lie, to defend it, to build around it. But what does that mean for the truth? If a true memory isn't enough to guide your actions, if it can be overpowered by something louder, simpler, more convenient, then how do you know which parts of yourself are real? How much of your life is based on echoes of things that never happened? You can try to be skeptical, you can fact-check, you can remind yourself to question your own certainty. But that doesn't protect you completely, because the most dangerous false memories aren't the ones other people give you. They're the ones you create yourself. They start when you're scared, when you're angry, when you need the world to make more sense than it does. And once they form, they don't feel like inventions. They feel like survival, like something you must believe to keep going. You might remember a betrayal that never happened. You might remember someone hating you when they were just afraid. You might remember a moment that explained everything, except it didn't. It was just one frame in a story you stitched together later. And maybe the worst part is knowing you've done this to others too. That someone, somewhere, remembers you saying something you never said, doing something you never did. That they built a whole version of you from a single glance, a misunderstood tone, a moment they replayed until it hardened into fact. You can't undo that. You can't argue your way out of someone else's fake memory. You become trapped inside a version of yourself you can't see, can't change, can't escape. So maybe the danger isn't just that people remember fake facts louder than true ones. Maybe the danger is that they live in those fake facts. They trust them, they pass them on. And over time, the truth isn't just forgotten, it's erased. And you're left living in a world built on memories that feel real, act real, shape everything around you, yet never existed. How do you outthink someone who's smarter than you? You don't. You guide them, quietly, invisibly, toward conclusions they believe they've reached on their own. It's easy to assume intelligence is a shield against manipulation, that the sharper your mind, the harder it is to deceive. But that belief rests on something very fragile, the assumption that being smart means being aware of your own vulnerabilities. It doesn't. In fact, intelligence often creates a new kind of blindness, a belief in your own immunity, a quiet arrogance that tells you you'd see it coming, that you can't be fooled because you've learned how others are fooled. But manipulation doesn't work through force. It doesn't push, it invites. It offers ideas that feel familiar, desirable, rational. It doesn't confront your mind, it partners with it. The smarter you are, the more complex your justifications, the more creative your ability to rationalize what you want to believe. Manipulation doesn't need to invent new beliefs for you. It only needs to offer small pieces, subtle suggestions, and your mind will build the rest. Proudly, you won't feel tricked. You'll feel brilliant, and that's the danger. You're not more protected, you're more exposed, because the tools you've sharpened, logic, deduction, pattern recognition, they aren't weapons against deception, they're instruments that can be used against you. If someone knows how you think, how you process truth, how you define credibility, they can bypass your skepticism entirely. They won't argue with you. They'll agree with you, just slightly more than they should. They'll echo your thoughts, reflect your values, flatter your insight, and once you trust them, they'll begin to steer. Just a few degrees at a time. You won't notice. You'll think you're becoming more refined, more certain, more correct. And if doubt ever creeps in, you'll use your intelligence to crush it, to remind yourself why you're right, why you've always been right. This is how the smartest people become the most certain and the most unreachable, not because they've been fooled against their will, but because they've been led in exactly the direction they already wanted to go. And it gets worse, because once a belief is chosen, especially by someone intelligent, it becomes defended, justified, reinforced by logic, framed with evidence, armored with conviction. The belief hardens, becomes identity. Any contradiction now feels like an attack. Any challenge becomes a threat, not to the belief itself, but to the intellect that formed it. And so the trap deepens. You begin to filter out anything that doesn't confirm your position. Not deliberately, just naturally. Slowly, you surround yourself with signals that support what you already know. You strengthen the walls of your reasoning, unaware that those same walls are becoming a cage. The manipulation is complete, and you'll never see it, because you're not being forced to believe something false. You're being allowed to believe something comfortable. That's all it takes. And so the most disturbing truth isn't that intelligence can be manipulated. It's that intelligence makes manipulation more elegant, more invisible, more permanent. Because the smarter you are, the better you are at building prisons you'll never recognize as prisons. And once you've locked yourself inside, no one else needs to hold the key. What if none of this is real? What if the world around you, the pain, the love, the memories, is part of a simulation? Not a theory, not a science fiction idea, but the actual nature of your existence. A complex system, coded by something you'll never see, running on rules you can't change. And your suffering still feels real. But does it matter? You try to hold on to meaning, to believe your emotions have weight, that your heartbreaks, your traumas, your regrets somehow count. But if the world is synthetic, designed, constructed from outside you, then who are you suffering for? Yourself? The designers? A viewer? A god? You can't answer that. And so you sit with the question, circling it slowly. If your life is simulated, does your pain lose value? You might tell yourself yes. That pain in a simulation is like pain in a dream, intense, consuming, but ultimately meaningless. You wake up and it's gone. But that's not how you experience it. You don't wake up, you live in it. You cry in it. You bleed, scream, break, recover inside a system that may not be real. And yet, it hurts anyway. So maybe the question isn't whether pain in a simulation matters to the system. Maybe it's whether it matters to you. Can you accept that something artificial can still hurt you deeply? Can you accept that you may be grieving inside a program and still call that grief real? Because it feels real. And if it feels real, what's the difference? You search for a moral anchor, something to tell you that truth gives suffering its meaning, that a real life has dignity and a fake one does not. But think carefully. If the suffering of a simulated person feels no different from your own, would you be willing to say it's irrelevant? Would you walk past their agony and call it a glitch? You wouldn't. You know you wouldn't. So why do you treat your own pain that way now? Maybe it's because the idea that you're living in something artificial makes your life feel smaller, fragile, like a story being told without your input. You fear becoming just a character, your struggles choreographed by a faceless code. You want your choices to matter, your regrets to shape something. You want your failures to mean more than just data. But what if they don't? What if every time you broke down, or gave up, or reached out for help, it only existed to create an emotional arc, a plot line, a moment? Would you still own those feelings? Or would they begin to feel like someone else's design? And how long could you survive like that, believing your pain is someone else's invention? It's tempting to say that meaning comes from autonomy, that if you're choosing, you're real. But that assumes the simulation controls you. What if it doesn't? What if it gives you every freedom, every illusion of self? What if it builds a world so precise, so complete, that your emotions arise naturally, just like they would in any physical reality? Then you're not controlled, you're just alone. Trapped in a system you'll never understand, living a life whose structure was given to you, but whose suffering is yours alone to feel. Does that make it meaningless, or more meaningful? Because now you're suffering for no reason. Not as punishment, not as part of some cosmic plan, not for growth or redemption. You're suffering because the simulation permits it. Because that's what emerged from your specific path. And that is maybe more terrifying than any theology or philosophy could offer. Because now you can't even pretend there's a purpose. You're left with one unbearable possibility, that pain doesn't need to be justified to exist, that it doesn't need to matter in order to be real, that something can be both artificial and devastating at the same time. You can be crying in a lie and still not be faking it. You want to believe that meaning can only come from truth. But if that's so, then your life, your whole emotional existence, vanishes the moment you question the foundation beneath it. And that feels like cruelty. Not because someone did it to you, but because you now have to live with a truth that makes everything feel hollow. So you try to forget. You try to live as if it's real. You go back to your routines, your relationships, your hopes. You pretend none of this is happening, because that's what everyone does, and that's the part no one tells you. Not that life might be a simulation, but that it might be what you're already trying not to think about. And you realize maybe the real suffering isn't the pain itself. Maybe it's knowing that if this is all fake, you're still hurting anyway. They lie before they care, before they share, before they cry, because someone else is crying, before they reach out to comfort, or protect, or forgive, before they understand why hurting someone else hurts. A child will tell a lie before they understand why the truth matters. And they'll do it with perfect instinct. No training, no example, no hesitation. They lie, not to hurt, but to hide, to protect themselves, to escape blame, to reshape reality into something safer. And they do it early, earlier than most people are willing to accept. Before they can even form full sentences, they begin to bend the truth. Not as an accident, not as confusion, but deliberately, as if something inside them already knows the value of deception. You want to believe that empathy comes first, that kindness is our starting point, that we're wired to care about others before we think about ourselves. But that's not how it works. Not really. Empathy is slow. It requires imagination, the ability to hold someone else's experience in your mind, to feel what they feel, even when it doesn't benefit you. But lying is fast. Lying is survival. It's simple and effective. A tool that works before we understand what it costs. And maybe that's the problem. Children lie before they understand that other people have minds, have feelings, have pain. The lie protects them, and they don't yet see what it might do to someone else. Because that awareness, the awareness that someone else is real, separate and vulnerable, takes longer to develop. So for a while, a child can lie without guilt, without hesitation, without empathy. But what does that say about us? Not about children, about us, about what we're made of, about the order in which our minds grow. We learn to manipulate before we learn to connect, to distort before we understand, to shield ourselves with fiction before we can reach towards someone else's truth, and we don't grow out of it. Not really, we just learn to hide it better, to wrap our lies in politeness, in justification, in half-truths. We say we're sparing someone's feelings. We say it's harmless. We say it's necessary. But underneath that, the instinct remains: protect yourself, even if it means twisting reality. Empathy asks you to open yourself, to risk something. Lying never does. That's why it comes first. That's why it's easier. And it doesn't stop with childhood. The pattern repeats. At every stage, in every relationship, there's always the same question: will you be honest, or will you protect yourself? Sometimes the answer is subtle. You tell a friend you're fine when you're not. You smile when you're falling apart. You pretend to care when you don't, or pretend not to care when you do. And sometimes it's sharper. You take credit for something you didn't do. You cover a mistake. You say what someone wants to hear, not because it's true, but because it's useful. And still, most people don't see themselves as liars, because the lies don't feel like lies. They feel like strategy, like survival, like common sense. You learned it early after all. Long before you could step into someone else's pain, you learned how to step around your own. Empathy requires effort. It asks for vulnerability. It makes you feel what isn't yours. But lying feels like control, like safety, like certainty. So which one do you really trust? When you're under pressure, scared, cornered, ashamed, what do you reach for? The lie or the feeling? You say you value honesty. You say you care about other people. But when the moment comes, when something real is at stake, do you risk being honest? Do you really let someone in, or do you retreat to the oldest instinct? Do you lie? Because if lying comes before empathy, if it's the first tool you ever learned to use, then maybe it's not just a habit. Maybe it's who you are underneath everything else. Not cruel, not broken, just human. But human in a way that's hard to admit. Human in a way that starts to feel like a flaw. You want to believe that goodness comes naturally, that compassion is built in, that we're born ready to care. But maybe that's the lie, and maybe it's the first one you ever told yourself. You reach for a glass of water, but your hand was already moving before you felt the decision. A second earlier, the muscles in your arm had begun to contract. Your fingers prepared to close around the glass. Your brain had already launched the action before you felt like you had chosen it. And yet you feel certain that you decided, that quiet confidence, that you are the one steering, choosing, willing each motion is an illusion. It isn't just suspicion. It's been measured over and over again. Neuroscientists have observed the signals. They've tracked the activity in your brain that initiates movement, and the findings are consistent. Your brain begins the process of action hundreds of milliseconds before you become consciously aware of having made a decision. The you who believes you're in charge is reacting to something that's already happened. It doesn't feel that way. It never does. You think you're choosing to speak, to move, to decide. But the signals in your brain betray a different story. You aren't the author of the act. You're just the narrator, and the narration is always delayed. This isn't just about physical movement. It extends further to judgment, to belief, to desire. You find yourself wanting something, and you believe you've chosen to want it. You feel anger, attraction, guilt, resolve, and assume those emotions follow a decision. But what if the order is reversed? What if the emotion came first, and the decision was a backfilled story? What if free will is not the cause of your actions, but the excuse for them? There's a subtle danger in that idea, not because it suggests you're a puppet, but because it calls into question what part of you is real. If the conscious you isn't making choices, then what is it doing? It's watching, rationalizing, building explanations for decisions that have already occurred. You feel hunger and tell yourself it's time to eat. You say the words, "I've decided," but the mechanism that led to that outcome was set in motion long before your awareness arrived. It means the conscious self, the part that thinks, reflects, and declares, is less a commander and more a spokesperson. And not a particularly honest one. You don't know why you chose what you chose, but the discomfort of admitting that pushes you to invent reasons. You say you took the job because it felt right, that you left the relationship because you needed space, that you snapped because someone crossed a line. But maybe none of that is true. Maybe those reasons are stories you tell yourself to hide the deeper truth, that your brain acted and you simply followed. And if that's true, then what is accountability? If decisions emerge before awareness, then when does responsibility begin? It's tempting to say, always, that responsibility must still rest with you. But what version of you are we talking about? The self who chose, or the self who thinks they chose? This is where the ground starts to slip, because if you're not the origin of your own choices, then who are you? A collection of thoughts observing a body in motion, a mind constantly catching up with what the brain has already done, or something else entirely, something less agent, more witness. The discomfort isn't just philosophical, it's personal. You've punished yourself for bad decisions, praised yourself for discipline, defined your identity by what you've chosen to do, to want, to avoid. But what if all of that was a facade? What if your character is just a retroactive explanation for patterns of behavior? And if so, can it change? Can a story you don't control be rewritten? This isn't fatalism. The brain is still capable of learning, adapting, redirecting. But the mechanism of that change may not begin with willpower. It may begin beneath it, before awareness, before reflection. Which means that your sense of transformation, of growing, deciding, becoming better, is also, in part, an illusion. Change happens, but you don't command it. You only notice when it's already begun. The more closely you examine the gap between choice and action, the more disturbing it becomes, because the more you realize you were never the one choosing. You were only the one noticing afterward and calling it choice. And if you listen carefully, you can feel that space, that tiny delay, that flicker between action and awareness, the part of you that believes it is free, arriving just a moment too late. Have you ever had a dream that made you feel ashamed the moment you woke up? Not because it was wrong in a way you could explain, but because something inside it felt too revealing, as if your own mind had quietly shown you a version of yourself you weren't ready to see. You didn't choose the dream. You didn't control what happened. And yet, as you open your eyes in the morning, you feel the echo of something private, something you instinctively want to forget. But the feeling doesn't go away. It lingers quietly behind everything else. You tell yourself it was meaningless, just a dream. But part of you isn't convinced. Part of you knows that it meant something. Something you're not sure you want to admit. Because dreams don't lie the way we do when we're awake. They don't filter, don't negotiate, don't consider consequences. They just surface, without shame, without hesitation. And sometimes what they bring to the surface is terrifying. You see someone in the dream you haven't thought about in years, and in the dream you touch them, or kiss them, or hurt them, and it feels real. It feels like something you wanted. But when you wake up, all you can think is why? Why did I dream that? What does it say about me? You try to move on, but the question stays with you, because deep down you understand that dreams are made of your own mind. There's no one else inside them, no one to blame. Everything that happens there comes from you, even the parts you hate. Especially the parts you hate. You start to wonder if your dreams know you better than you know yourself. If the parts of you that speak at night are the parts you silence during the day. The urges, the anger, the fears you've never said out loud. Maybe your dreams don't create new desires, they just stop hiding the ones you already had. And maybe that's what scares you. Not that the dream was random, but that it wasn't, that it came from somewhere real, that it showed you something you've been avoiding. You think of the way you act around certain people, the way you laugh too hard, or stay too quiet, or avoid their eyes for just a moment too long. You tell yourself there's nothing there, but then you dream of them, and the lie becomes harder to maintain. It's easier to blame the dream than to ask what it revealed. Because if it's true, if you really do want what you dreamed, then everything changes. Then you have to face a version of yourself that doesn't match the one you show the world. Then maybe you've worked hard to build that version, to keep things simple, to be who people expect. But your dreams don't care about that. They only care about what's underneath. And what's underneath is never simple. Sometimes the dream shows you something violent, something cruel, and you wake up with your heart racing, wondering if you're capable of things you've never allowed yourself to imagine. You want to believe it was just fear, just stress, just noise. But part of you isn't so sure. Part of you worries it was desire. And now you carry that worry with you, quietly, all day. You try to bury it, but the more you bury it, the more it takes root. Because once a thought appears, once your mind has shown you that it's possible, you can't unsee it. You can't unthink it. It becomes part of you, whether you accept it or not. And that's the quiet horror of it. Not that your dreams are strange, but that they are honest. That in your most unguarded moments, when your defenses are gone, your mind whispers things you'd never admit out loud. Not to anyone, not even to yourself. And maybe that's why we're so eager to dismiss dreams, to laugh them off, to say they don't matter. Because if they do, if they really are reflections of something buried, then we're not as in control as we like to think. Then we're not the person we present to the world. We're something else, something messier, something darker. And maybe the most disturbing part isn't what your dreams reveal. It's the quiet realization that some part of you already knew. What if you were told to sit alone in silence, with no distractions, no devices, no music, no tasks, just you and your thoughts for 15 minutes? And what if, next to you, there was a button, pressing, it would deliver a small electric shock? It wouldn't injure you, but it would hurt. Unpleasant, sharp, just enough to interrupt your thoughts. Most people, when placed in this situation, press the button, not once, but often. Some do it again and again, not because they enjoy pain, but because they can't stand the alternative. Silence, when it's complete, feels threatening. We tell ourselves we crave peace, quiet, stillness. But when we finally get it, we recoil. Because in the silence, everything we've pushed down starts to rise. Memories, regrets, questions we've ignored. The noise of daily life covers all that up. But when that noise is gone, we're forced to meet ourselves. And sometimes meeting yourself hurts more than a shock. You begin to wonder why discomfort feels safer than quiet. Why a predictable pain is easier to bear than the uncertainty of your own mind. The shock is controllable, measurable. Your thoughts are not. Once they begin, you can't always stop where they go. You don't get to choose what rises in the silence. Maybe that's what you fear. You thought distraction was a habit, but now it feels more like a defense. You look around and see how deeply this need for escape runs. We talk constantly, fill every pause, look at screens in elevators, scroll through feeds at red lights, turn on a show the second we get home. We think we're relaxing, but maybe we're hiding from the truth that being alone with your mind, even for a few minutes, is almost unbearable. Because when you're silent, you start to hear the parts of yourself you usually drown out. The doubts, the contradictions, the parts of you that don't fit neatly into the story you tell about who you are, and you can't argue with them. You can't reason them away, they're just there, waiting. You'd think silence would bring peace, but for many, it brings a confrontation and the shock. It becomes a release, a way to say, I'd rather feel pain than hear what I'm thinking. This isn't about weakness, it's not stupidity, it's exposure. Being alone in silence is like standing in a mirror that doesn't flatter you, that doesn't let you look away. No edits, no distractions, just you. Some people call this boredom, but boredom is rarely the real feeling. Often, it's just the label we give to discomfort we don't want to name: anxiety, regret, shame, grief. They all float just beneath the surface, and in silence they rise. You might ask yourself what kind of person would choose pain over peace. But the question itself hides the truth. The shock isn't chosen over peace, it's chosen over exposure. And here's the part that's harder to accept. The discomfort of silence isn't rare. It's not limited to a few people. It's most people, which means the desire to escape ourselves, even at the cost of pain, is common, ordinary, human. You begin to wonder if modern life is built around this. Not just the devices, the entertainment, the endless updates, but the entire structure, the pace, the volume, the distractions, not designed to enrich us, but to protect us from a kind of unbearable stillness. Because stillness reveals the difference between who we are and who we pretend to be. And maybe you're not afraid of the silence itself. Maybe you're afraid of how easily your mind fills it, with things you've tried not to feel, questions you've refused to ask, feelings you've hidden even from yourself. The silence doesn't create them. It just stops hiding them. And so the button sits there, waiting. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't answer your questions. It just interrupts, and sometimes interruption feels like relief. But the deeper discomfort, the part we don't say aloud, isn't the thought that we might choose pain over silence. It's the realization that we already do, all the time. Not with electric shocks, but with the 1,000 small ways we avoid being alone with ourselves. You tell yourself you'd never press the button, but you already have, in other forms. You already choose distraction over depth, interruption over reflection, noise over self-confrontation. So maybe the real question isn't why people press the button. Maybe it's why they ever stop. Could you love someone and still wish they didn't exist? Not because they hurt you, not because they failed you, but because their presence in the world feels like a weight you can't carry, a gravity you can't escape, because their existence changes the shape of your thoughts, the tone of your days, the rhythm of your inner life, and not in a way that feels right. You might think love should cancel that out. That love should conquer resentment, erase tension, neutralize despair. Sometimes love only makes it worse, because now you care. Now you're attached. Now this person, this single, flawed human, is inside your mind, your future, your identity. And maybe you never wanted them there. Maybe you let them in before you understood what it would cost. You try to convince yourself that love means commitment, that it means acceptance. But deep down, there's a quiet, persistent whisper. I wish you weren't here. I wish you had never arrived. I wish I didn't have to carry the burden of feeling anything for you. It doesn't make sense. It feels cruel. You imagine what they would say if they knew. You imagine their face, the betrayal in their eyes. You picture the hurt. And still the thought returns. You love them. You wish they didn't exist. How can that be possible? How can two such opposite truths occupy the same space, the same mind, the same beating heart? But they can, because love is not purity. It's not peace. Love is full of contradiction. It binds you to people you might otherwise avoid. It keeps you close to people you don't like. People who exhaust you, disappoint you, drain you. Love is sticky, relentless, and sometimes it feels like a trap. You watch them move through the world, unaware of the effect they have on you. You see their habits, their flaws, their endless repetition of behaviors that wear you down, and you feel the love. But it doesn't fix anything. It doesn't protect you from the thought you've tried to suppress. What would my life be like if you weren't here? Not dead, just never born, never introduced, never woven into your world, a clean slate, a freedom you didn't know you'd lose. You don't want to hurt them, you don't want to leave them, but sometimes you wish you'd never met, that the timeline had skipped them, that your world had stayed intact, undisturbed, unshaped by their orbit. This isn't hatred. Hatred is simpler, cleaner. It gives you permission to disconnect, but love keeps you connected, even when you wish you weren't. And the more you care, the more you wish they were different. And the more they stay the same, the more the thought grows, quietly, shamefully, persistently. You might never say it out loud, you might never act on it, but it's there, in the silence, in the spaces between words, in the moments you're alone and honest. And if you ever try to explain it, people won't understand. They'll call it selfish, cruel, broken. They'll tell you love should never coexist with that kind of thought. But maybe they've never had to carry it. Maybe their love has never been this complicated. You wonder if you're the only one. If this contradiction is proof that something's wrong with you, but you suspect you're not alone, that others feel it too, that somewhere someone else is sitting in silence, loving someone deeply and wishing quietly that they'd never been born. And that thought doesn't make the love disappear. It doesn't make the person disappear. It just lingers, quiet and inescapable. Because sometimes love doesn't bring peace. Sometimes it brings pressure, guilt, exhaustion, and a quiet, lingering wish for a version of life that doesn't include them. You still smile at them, still care, still remember why you love them. But behind it all, the wish remains. Not because they're evil, not because you want revenge, just because your life would be easier without the weight of them. And you don't know what that makes you. You don't know if you're cruel or just tired. But you know the feeling is real, and you know it won't go away. You love them, and still you wish they didn't exist. Why is it that someone who speaks the truth can be ignored, ridiculed, even punished, while someone who tells a beautiful lie can become powerful, admired, and followed? Think carefully. You've seen it happen. A person who points out uncomfortable facts is labeled negative. A person who expresses doubt is told they're cynical. But a person who offers hope, even if it's false, is seen as a leader. Their confidence is mistaken for wisdom. Their certainty for truth. Truth alone has no charm. It doesn't adapt itself to your desires. It doesn't make promises. It doesn't comfort. Often it wounds, and people don't like to be wounded, even by reality, so they drift toward belief. Belief is easier. Belief gives you direction, purpose, belonging. It asks less from you than truth does. Belief doesn't require verification or evidence. It only requires that you commit to it. Once you believe, the discomfort of uncertainty disappears. The chaos of doubt goes quiet, and because of that, belief is rewarded. Socially, emotionally, even materially. People who express strong belief, especially in things others want to hear, are trusted more, promoted more, loved more, even if they're wrong. This is why politics thrives on conviction, not correctness. Why influencers go viral with falsehoods, not facts. Why religions grow not by proving their doctrine, but by strengthening people's sense of identity and meaning. Because in most places, truth is not the currency of power, belief is. Think about how institutions function. Schools reward students who confidently repeat accepted answers, not the ones who question the framework. Workplaces promote those who align with the company culture, not those who expose inefficiencies. Social groups embrace those who echo shared views, not those who challenge them. Truth is tolerated only when it's convenient, but belief is embraced because it unites. And now you might feel the urge to protest, to say, "But I value truth." And maybe you do, but even then, you probably value your truth. The version of reality that makes sense to you, that aligns with your identity, that confirms what you already suspect. And when a different truth threatens that structure, you resist. You rationalize. You dismiss. Belief is adhesive. It holds your world together. Truth, when it contradicts that world, becomes an intruder. So what do? You defend belief. And if enough people do it together, that belief becomes a norm, a law, a reality even. And anyone who questions it becomes dangerous. This is why societies silence whistleblowers. Why scientists who challenge dominant theories are mocked. Why historians who revisit painful truths are accused of revisionism. Because belief must be preserved. Not because it's right, but because it's useful. And when you begin to see this clearly, it becomes harder to speak. You start to wonder if truth even matters. If it has any value at all, beyond personal conviction. You start to notice how quickly truth collapses under the pressure of belief, and how easily people discard it when it becomes inconvenient. Then you look at yourself, and you realize you've done it too. You've chosen comfort over clarity, reassurance over rigor. You've let yourself believe things because they felt right, not because they were proven. You've dismissed truths that didn't fit. And maybe, quietly, you still do. Because truth is cold, belief is warm. Truth isolates, belief connects. Truth can leave you uncertain, lost, alone. But belief offers belonging, identity, security, even if it's wrong. And now you understand why the world rewards belief. Not because it's true, but because it's useful, safe, seductive. And why truth, even when it's right, often goes unheard. Because it offers no comfort, no promise, just itself, alone, non-yielding. And most people aren't looking for that. Not really. They're looking for something to believe in, something to hold on to, even if they have to let go of truth to get it. Imagine the person you hate most. Not just someone who annoys you or who holds beliefs you find wrong, but someone whose actions feel unforgivable. Someone who, in your eyes, has caused real pain. Now imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that your lives have been reversed. Their memories, their pain, their upbringing, all of it is yours now. And everything you are, everything you've done, belongs to them. It's not a metaphor. You wake up in their body, with their past, their instincts, their traumas, and they wake up in yours. Would you act the same way they did? It's tempting to say no. You'd insist you'd make different choices, that even in their position, you'd still be better, kinder, more moral. But how can you be sure? How much of who you are is shaped by your circumstances, your childhood, your culture, your biology? If you had been born with their genetics, raised in their home, surrounded by their influences, would you still be you, or would you become the very person you claim to despise? This isn't about forgiveness. It's about clarity. about seeing how fragile your identity is, how easily it bends under pressure. We want to believe we have agency, that our choices define us, not our conditions. But most of what you call you wasn't chosen. It was shaped. You didn't pick your temperament, your family, your first language, your earliest fears. They were given to you, and they shaped everything that followed. So, how much credit do you really deserve for being better, for not doing what they did? And if they'd had your life, your support, your education, your moments of grace, could they have turned out like you? These questions don't excuse harm. They don't erase responsibility. But they do reveal something darker, that your moral superiority might not be real. It might just be luck. And luck doesn't make you good. It just makes you safe. Think about the moments when you've been cruel, when you've lashed out, lied, betrayed. You had reasons, didn't you? Stress, fear, exhaustion. You tell yourself you were pushed, that it wasn't the real you. But when others fail, you don't give them that same generosity. You call them monsters. You assume intention, not pain. You assume evil, not context. Now imagine someone else watching your worst moments with no knowledge of what led to them. Would they see a good person struggling or just another monster? This is the uncomfortable truth. Goodness is fragile. It's easy to be kind when you're comfortable. Easy to be fair when you're not afraid. But what happens when you're cornered? When you're desperate? When you feel powerless and unloved? Do you still act like yourself? Or does something else emerge? And if you do become someone unrecognizable, if you hurt others, lie, cheat, even destroy, does that mean the monster was always inside you? Or was it made? What if the same is true for them? The people you call evil, broken, inhuman. What if they weren't born that way? What if they were simply shaped differently? What if you had started where they started, ended up where they ended up? You'd be looking back at your own face right now, asking the same question. And maybe that's what you hate most. Not them, but the terrifying possibility that the only thing separating you from them is luck. You don't want to believe that. You want to believe in heroes and villains. You want to believe your decency is a choice, not a privilege. Because if that's not true, if goodness is just a product of favorable conditions, then who are you when those conditions disappear? You're forced to confront the possibility that every judgment you've ever made was shallow, that your moral clarity was built on ignorance, that you looked at someone drowning and mocked their inability to breathe. And now the roles are reversed. You're drowning. You're doing the very things you once condemned. And suddenly the line between good and evil disappears. Not because evil isn't real, but because you see it in yourself. That's the shift. The horror. It's not that monsters exist. It's that if the roles were reversed, you'd be one too. What if the only difference between a hero and a villain is the story we're told? Not the actions, not the choices, just the frame, the narration, the costume. You're taught to believe in moral categories, good and evil, selfless and selfish, right and wrong. But what if all of that is just branding? What if the lines you believe in are marketing, not morality? Consider this. A man defies a global power, arms the weak, trains them to resist. He's hunted, labeled a terrorist, vilified. But in a different country, a different era, he'd be a freedom fighter, a hero. The difference isn't in what he does. It's in who gets to tell the story, who gets to define the terms. You might think you'd know the difference instinctively, that you can feel the hero's nobility and the villain's malice. But that feeling is taught. It's shaped by repetition, by symbols, by language. You're not feeling the truth. You're reacting to the narrative that's been wrapped around it. Now think of someone in power, a leader who orders violence, surveillance, control. If you agree with their goal, you call it leadership. If you don't, you call it tyranny. But the orders are the same. The power is the same. Only the side you stand on changes the label. This isn't just about politics or war, it's personal, too. Think about the people you admire, figures who stood up, broke rules, did what others couldn't. Now imagine if they'd failed. If their efforts led to disaster, would they still be heroes to you? Or would history rewrite them as reckless, dangerous, selfish? You already know the answer. You've seen it happen. People, once celebrated, are torn down when their image becomes inconvenient. And those once hated are quietly rehabilitated when their story becomes useful. There's no consistent moral line, just shifting public needs, shifting perspectives. You might believe that intentions matter, that a hero does what they do for the right reasons and a villain for the wrong ones. But you don't really know anyone's reasons. You just hear what they tell you or what someone else tells you about them. Motives are hidden, complicated, reinterpreted. And even if someone means well, meaning well doesn't erase harm. There's a discomfort here you don't want to feel. Because if this is true, if the line between hero and villain is only a matter of branding, then your moral judgments become less stable, less certain. You can no longer trust your instincts to tell you who to admire or condemn. You have to admit that some of your heroes might be villains to someone else, and that some of the people you hate might be seen as saviors, just outside your frame of reference. You start to question your own place in the story. If someone told it differently, would you be the antagonist? Would your choices, your actions, be reframed as harmful, oppressive, selfish? How much of your sense of goodness depends on being seen through the right lens? This is what branding does. It doesn't change reality. It changes how reality feels. It wraps actions in symbols. It turns violence into justice. It turns control into order. It turns rebellion into evil. And when you're inside the story, it's hard to see the wrapping. It just feels true. But maybe the scariest part is this: you want heroes. You need villains. You want the world to divide cleanly so you can feel anchored, safe. If the good guys and bad guys aren't clearly marked, how do you know where to stand, what to believe in, who to trust? So you cling to branding. You let it guide you. You don't question the narrative, because questioning it means stepping into moral fog. It means giving up the comfort of certainty. And yet, somewhere deep down, you know it's not that simple. You know the labels lie. You've seen them shift. You've seen how easily someone's image can be repackaged. How one speech, one photo, one carefully edited clip can rewrite an entire person. So now you sit with the discomfort, the possibility that there are no heroes, only people whose stories are told well, and no villains, only people whose stories are told poorly. The line you thought was moral turns out to be aesthetic, promotional, strategic. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every act, every decision, every reputation becomes suspect. You start to wonder how many people you've misjudged, how many truths you've accepted because they were well presented, how many lies you've swallowed because they came with the right branding. Because in the end, the story that gets told isn't the one that's most true, it's the one that's most useful, most convenient, most emotionally satisfying. And the difference between a hero and a villain might just be who has the better logo. Some people feel pleasure when others are in pain. That sentence isn't just a diagnosis or a headline. It's a quiet admission of something real, something human, something closer than most want to admit. And maybe you've seen it before, not in horror films or crime stories, but in glances, in small moments. A smile at someone's humiliation, A rush of satisfaction when a rival stumbles. That quick, fleeting joy when someone finally gets what you think they deserve. It feels wrong to admit, because you're supposed to be kind, empathetic, civilized. You're not supposed to enjoy someone else's suffering. But sometimes, in those hidden corners of your mind, you do. And the discomfort doesn't come from the act itself. It comes from the realization that it felt good. What do you do with that feeling? You bury it, call it something else. Justice, karma. You convince yourself they earned it, that the pleasure you feel is moral, even noble. But deep down, you know that's not quite true. The feeling wasn't clean. It wasn't restrained. It was warm, electric, alive. And if you're honest, you know it goes further than that. You don't just feel it when someone harms others. You felt it with people you envy. People who've succeeded where you failed. When they fall, even just a little, it brings relief. Their pain shrinks something unbearable in you. It's not because you're cruel, it's because you're tired of feeling behind, of feeling unseen, of pretending you don't notice how others thrive while you struggle. Their suffering makes the world feel more fair, even if just for a second. There's a name for this. Schadenfreude. Pleasure at another's misfortune. It's common, universal even, but that word is too easy, too clean. It makes something primal sound like a personality quirk. It hides what's really happening, because sometimes that pleasure isn't passive. Sometimes you want them to hurt, not just fall by accident, but break. You imagine it, fantasize about it, and it doesn't feel sick. It feels necessary, like a balance has been restored. And maybe it has, because when life feels unfair, when you're quietly drowning in resentment and shame, someone else's suffering becomes proof that pain isn't just yours to bear, that maybe the universe sees you, even if only through their downfall. But now you've crossed a line, not through action, through thought. You didn't hurt anyone, you didn't cause their suffering, you only wanted it. Is that better? Is that enough? You tell yourself yes. You cling to the fact that you haven't done anything wrong, but the desire lingers. And you begin to wonder what would happen if no one were watching, if there were no consequences. If the world gave you permission, would you still hold back? You think of people who didn't. Bullies, abusers, dictators, monsters. It's easy to see them as different, diseased, born wrong. But what if they just stopped hiding what you still pretend not to feel? What if the line between you and them isn't moral, but circumstantial? If that thought disturbs you, it should, because it means your goodness might not be as solid as you believe. It means that under the right pressure, the right humiliation, the right betrayal, you might take that feeling one step further, and that feeling is ancient. It predates laws, predates civilization. For most of human history, survival meant crushing others, dominating, winning. Pain was currency, and pleasure in that pain was a sign of strength. We think we've evolved, but watch a crowd at a public shaming. Read the comments under a scandal. Listen to the laughter when someone loses everything. The appetite for suffering hasn't disappeared. It's just been rebranded, turned into content, into entertainment. But it's still there, quietly feeding something inside you. You might want to believe it's always directed at the guilty, that your pleasure is principled. But the truth is, you don't always know. Sometimes you enjoy the pain first and justify it after. Sometimes deep down, you don't care if they deserve it. You just want to feel better. And it works. That's the problem. Their pain relieves something in you. It softens your own, even if only for a moment. But that moment comes with a cost. Because once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. Once you've tasted the pleasure in someone else's pain, you never forget how easy it was, how natural, how good. You may never act on it. You may never cross that final threshold, but knowing the door is there, knowing how thin it is, changes you. And now, when you look at yourself, the image isn't as clear. The boundary between kindness and cruelty is softer, blurrier, more fragile than you thought. You still believe you're a good person, but now you understand how much of that belief depends on silence, on secrecy, on never letting anyone see the pleasure you tried to hide.